So, some 35 years ago, Francis Fukuyama published his now notorious essay, The End of History. It was 1989, and the crumbling Berlin Wall symbolized a collapse of communism so total that Fukuyama boldly asserted that history was over. The major ideological battles had ended, and liberal democracy was the last thing standing. Fukuyama's optimism led to a general bewilderment at the unfolding of events in the 21st century. As dictators took power and terrorism dominated the news, his End of History was reduced, I would argue, to a cautionary tale for political scientists. So the sequels to Fukuyama's End of History are now, I submit, Samuel Moyn's Liberalism Against Itself and Patrick Deneen's Why Liberalism Failed. Right. So in a very short span of time, we've gone from thinking liberalism is triumph to the fact that liberalism is failed. Far from triumphant, then, liberalism is now, quote, in crisis. It is, quote, in ruins. It's on the precipice. It's coming apart at the seams. The ship is sinking. These are all quotes from those books. Metaphors, I think, are revealing. Contemporary political and social commentators of all stripes are perennially tempted to view society as a mechanism with moving parts. In other words, liberalism is something that can rise and sink and be derailed or stop running. So many of these experts see themselves as engineers of socio-political systems, tasked with diagnosis and repair. So they marshal data, charts, graphs on everything from political participation to demographic change, to income distribution and unemployment levels, all to propose technical fixes for political and social machinery, or the building of entirely new systems. Unfortunately, such mechanistic metaphors render people entirely powerless. So many of today's books and articles on the liberal crisis relegate people to the predicates of sentences. Sometimes this becomes positively comedic. And we see in some of these books, the white working class, single mothers, immigrants, the police, Silicon Valley executives, and even Donald Trump as symptoms of a broken politics. This denial of human agency is, in part, I would argue, the long tail of the Enlightenment, which sees people as nothing more than organisms indistinguishable from one another in their subjection to the laws of nature. In the modern era, neurology and endocrinology are often marshaled to explain everything from love to political allegiance, and we are particularly told, especially in the theories of the new unconscious, that whenever we think we're making rational decisions, we are actually being manipulated by forces beyond our control. We are fully determined, Robert Sapolsky tells us, by biology over which we have no control, interacting with the environment over which we have no control. In other words, analysts of the liberal crisis have come not to rescue liberalism, but to bury it. This is most clearly revealed in, and I obsess about him, and I apologize for this, but I really am fascinated by Yuval Noah Harari and his various books. He's the darling of Silicon Valley at the moment and of the technocratic elite, or he was until his sort of most recent, I'll explain in a minute. And he swept into the political discourse in part with his breathtaking book, Homo Deus, which confidently asserted, and here I think he really does resemble Fukuyama, and I quote, "The era when humankind stood helpless before natural epidemics is probably over." That's 2015. And he even mused, what will scientists, investors, bankers, and presidents do all day? The book catapulted to popularity precisely because of its radical claims that progress was going to improve life so quickly and so completely that humanity would become the man-god, Homo Deus. Soon, he declared, humans will become genetically and technologically enhanced beings who will eventually live forever. Lost amidst the optimism of Harari's vision was a more sinister prediction. Man-godhood, according to Harari, will be a Faustian bargain. The new superior race of men will destroy liberal democracy because they will have finally revealed the illusion at the heart of liberalism, which is free will. Unfortunately, Harari writes, free will isn't a scientific reality. And as soon as we understand it, he writes, liberalism will collapse. What will take its place? Harari is quite clear. If organisms lack free will, it implies we can manipulate and even control their desires using drugs, genetic engineering, and direct brain stimulation. And here we must pause. Who is the we in this sentence? Are these the so-called experts, the technocrats? And how are they able to rise above their unconscious impulses and desires and manage the lives of others? This is no mere philosophical exercise. It reveals the dark side of modern technocratic expertise. So it's been called a technocratic mindset, preference to use expertise to manage behavior, but it never explains or justifies itself. And here I submit, and this is where I actually get to the Morson side of the story, here I submit that Harari resembles nothing less than the Inquisitor in the legend of the Grand Inquisitor. Dostoevsky was an old cardinal who blames uncontrolled freedom for humanity's troubles and declares that, quote, freedom must be crushed in order to end hunger, war, and poverty. And this reminds us of Harari. People, the Inquisitor writes, are feeble, depraved, insignificant, and mutinous. And given to too much independence, they merely squander it for the sake of greed. Conflict. The solution is obvious. At last, having conquered freedom, the Inquisitor says, he will take pride in having done so in order to make people happy. In other words, it's the Inquisitors who are free, and they are the only ones who are free, to engineer others and engineer the rest of us, and they never have to justify their authority. Homo Deus then is then the man God who takes upon himself the management of pathetic and helpless humanity for its own good. In other words, it is precisely our impoverished view of human nature and of human freedom that is the root cause of the liberal crisis. So Harari himself is a contributor to what is essentially the liberal crisis. Until we reconnect to what it means to be human, no true solution to our present crisis is possible. And here I submit the God of onions points the way. We must turn away, at least temporarily, from the enormity of populism and presidential politics and foreign policy, social stratification, and eschew the temptations of statistics, polls, conditions, and symptoms. We must start very small from the standpoint of the person. By looking more closely at human nature in all of its complexity, we can go beyond mechanistic reductions of human nature to innate impulses and explore the rational and irrational combination of emotions, desires, and aspirations that make up the uniqueness of individuals and their aspirations. We need a modern answer to the old-fashioned question of human nature that can only be found in the painstaking work of defining personhood. Our path to finding the person, I submit, is found in the literary analysis of Gary Saul Morson. And here I will turn to Morson's wonderful essay dedicated to smallness, I would argue, The God of Onions, the Brothers Karamazov, and the Mythic Prosaic. What is so remarkable about this, about Morson's scholarship in general, and this essay in particular, is his ability to help us to see things that might otherwise be invisible in great literature. According to Morson, Dostoevsky narrated two basic approaches to the problem of human suffering. The first approach desired a complete and universal solution, an apocalyptic one, often, or eschatological one. The characters who pursued this approach desire exploits, right? Big dramatic acts that will change the world in some way. This is true of terrorists and even religious millenarians alike. I would submit that this is true of technocrats like Harari. Unfortunately, this path often leads to disillusionment in oneself and others, and the loss of the ability to see humanity at all, such as the psychology of the Grand Inquisitor. And Morson writes about the Grand Inquisitor, he turned away from people and ended up hating them as, quote, pitiful empirical beings created in jest. The second approach, Morson tells us, is deceptively small, simpler and smaller, exemplified in the legend recounted by Grushenka and Brothers Karamazov of a wicked woman who ends up in hell after death, but who is given a second chance at salvation because she once offhandedly gave a beggar an onion. For Morson, this parable reveals a different kind of exploit, uninquisitorial, the doing of small acts of kindness, and in so doing, making them the, quote, basis for our redefinition as persons and our redemption as human beings. The God of Onions is an analysis of the novel Brothers Karamazov, but it can be applied, I would argue, and I have done this in the classroom, with remarkable results to Crime and Punishment as well. Dostoevsky attempted in Brothers Karamazov to craft a Christian response to the Grand Inquisitor, and the result was Father Zosima, or at least that's what most scholars argue, and I would agree, who does indeed prophesy or preach a gospel of small deeds and personal encounters. However, the God of Onions, I would submit that the absolute polar opposite to the Grand Inquisitor in Dostoevsky is a character from Crime and Punishment, and the perfect character to reveal Morson's understanding of the human person, and that's the servant and cook employed by Raskolnikov's landlady to care for her tenants. She is easily missed, and I would argue she almost seems like an afterthought, and her name is Nastasia. Thus, we only know her first name, as I recall in the text. When we first meet Nastasia, she's yelling at Raskolnikov, "You're wasting away." He has gone without dinner for 2 weeks. He's depressed and withdrawn. He hasn't paid his rent. And she offers him tea and cabbage soup, which she actually has not been paid for, really, but she's just worried that he's hungry. He is a slovenly tenant who has not paid his rent. He sleeps in his clothes, and yet she is continuously concerned about him and watches over him, receiving from him no thanks whatsoever. Even when he yells at her one time, "Go away," right, into his face, she stays a little bit longer and looks at him, as Dostoevsky writes, with compassion. And in the subsequent times we meet her in the text, she is always offering tea. This is all she does, though. She offers tea, meals, and concern. That's her sole task in the novel. When after his murder of the old woman, Raskolnikov falls victim to a terrible fever, Nastasia is the central person who cares for him. And as he's coming to, he remembers Nastasia was often at his side. She's just there. Why does she do that? Nastasia, what I like about Nastasia in the novel is she's one of the few characters who has no obvious philosophy of life, no articulated higher dreams or visions. She is silently in the background while others talk, argue, and philosophize. She's often pictured as sort of staying back and listening as other people argue. Her few spoken words are almost entirely drowned out by the reckless Nietzschean yearnings of Raskolnikov, the Machiavellian dreams of Zhernokyeyev, and yet even the otherworldly pronouncements of Sonia Marmeladova. So she has none of these things. Through Morson's God of Onions, however, we see her as the very epitome of what he calls prosaic goodness, the doing a small, almost invisible act of kindness for the sake of another person, no matter how inconsequential. The ethic of Onions, that's my term, the ethic of Onions then is precisely Nastasia's. I submit that the ethic of Onions has a complementary philosophy, that of personalism. And here, because I always do this now, someday I will not do it anymore, because I will finish my book. But I'm going to talk about Nikolai Berdyaev, because I always have to. I think that the ethic of Onions has its counterpart in the personalism of Nikolai Berdyaev, the Russian religious philosopher of the 20th century, who also wanted to start small. Berdyaev insisted that each and every human being, no matter how seemingly insignificant, has dignity and value, created in the image and likeness of God. So following the philosopher Vladimir Solovyov, Berdyaev asserted that the value of the individual not in a Harari-like man-godhood, right? But in God-manhood, in each individual's potential for theosis, for achieving divinity. For this reason, Berdyaev insisted that the person could not be sacrificed for the sake of any other good, abstract or collective, and it was the reason why he ended up renouncing Marxism very early in his life, because he felt even back at that time that Marxism did not value the person and the individual, right? Would sacrifice the individual gladly. We see it in Lenin's quote from earlier today, but he saw that coming before Lenin even started speaking about it. He was actually categorical about it. And this, I think this is kind of a shocking statement and helps us really to position Berdyev's thought. He says, the person is of a higher value than the state, the nation, mankind, or nature, and indeed, it does not even form part of that series. So, super radical. This radical vision of the person might be interpreted as the height of selfishness and self-regard. And that is how people critique, for instance, individualism. But personalism is not individualism. It is not the celebration of an ego that demands respect and affirmation. Personalism distinguishes itself from individualism in that it asserts that personality is always relational. Egocentrism, for Berdyaev, was an obsession with the I, the consideration of everything from the perspective of the I, the ego. But such egocentrism destroys personality. True personhood, Berdyaev believed, is not self-sufficient. It cannot be self-satisfied. It always assumes the existence of other persons. It is the movement out of oneself and into another. The I must be developed for Berdyaev in its conjunction with the other person, the thou or the you. Now, Berdyaev's philosophy of personalism is distinctly Russian Christian, but he was delighted to discover, I mean, when I say I and thou, some of you will immediately think of Martin Buber. And I was delighted to discover that actually the two of them met, were delighted in each other's meeting, and corresponded thereafter. For Berdyaev, as for Buber, the I-thou, the I-you relationship was of central importance for the development of the human person. And so Berdyaev was particularly delighted, I think, in Buber's dialogic nature of the I and the thou. The recognition of a subject by another subject is true relationship. It is interpersonal and it is intimate. And he was also delighted by Buber's trenchant observation that human beings, and particularly in modernity, human beings are tempted to see one another as an it, as an object to be appropriated, as something to be used or manipulated, right? As seeing the other person as a means to your own end, or as some utilitarian sort of useful, not useful category, right? Seeing other people as objects means living in what Buber called the it world, the S-Welt, right? So the world of it's, the world of objects. It's the world of objectification, Berdyaev really liked that phrase, and the world of manipulation. Dare we say that the world of technocratic expertise, a la Harari and the rest of them, is precisely an it world, as Buber would define it, right? Seeing other people as mechanisms for the achievement of some greater good. But this it world is separation and isolation. It is precisely the inquisitor's contempt for, quote, the pitiful empirical beings created in jest, that creates an it world around the Grand Inquisitor. The alternative for Buber was the thou world, the du Welt, in which the person sees and acknowledges the freedom and dignity of the other and makes the concerns of the other his or her own. To be present, this is such a lovely phrase of Buber's, to always be present with another, right? Not to want something from them, not to demand something from them, not even to necessarily give something to them, but to be present with them in a relationship where time and space vanish. This is what Buber called the between. You sit between two people and you are you and that other person is, right? You are yourself and the other person is the other person, but you are somehow together and not especially abstracting out that relationship between the two of you, right? You're just present. Now, Buber did say, like, sometimes people do have to become it's for us. There's just no way around it, right? They're people in our past. We don't see them anymore. They've been reduced to an object of our imagination or our reminiscence. But the spending of time in the du Welt, in the you world, is precisely what rescues us from objectification. And by acknowledging and seeing the freedom and dignity of the other, making the concerns of the other his or her own, this I-thou relationship actually and now me talking, right? The I-thou relationship reveals the God of onions, right? So, I mean, for Buber, that is the I-thou relationship we have with one another reveals God to us, right? That's how we see God in this. God is not an object, it's not an it. God is a you to whom we talk, but the only way we know how to talk to God is because we can talk to other people as also a person. And I submit that God of Buber's and God of Verdia's is the God of onions. He's not an object of human consciousness, right? But a thou who desires relationship with the person and awaits the response of that person. For Berdyaev, this was Buber's most important theological contribution, that the entirety of religious life is relationship, a dialogue between persons and between God and people, in which each person not only hears the word of God, but responds or answers. Most importantly, the God of onions does not want exploits, does not want dramatic, it happens. There are saints' lives, stories in the past where people do sacrifice themselves. But the God of onions values, as much as these exploits, in response to his call, prosaic goodness, right? The offering, in Brothers Karamazov, Gary Saul Morson talks about how Dmitri once wakes up and he finds a pillow under his head. He has no idea, some kind person put a pillow under Dmitri's head. Right? And this is how you had this dream of human suffering and not really sure, right? So what is prosaic goodness then? It's offering someone a pillow when they're tired. It's offering an onion to a beggar. It's acts too small for anyone to see, remember, or reward. Right? By seeing others as persons to whom prosaic goodness can be given, is not to see them as manipulable or part of some political system or as its, but rather as thous. In Crime and Punishment, Nastasia's unspoken ethic of onions, if you will, and perhaps even unformulated ethic of onions, goes sort of weirdly, as far as I can trace it in the novel, it really just weirdly kind of it tails off. She does what good she can because implicitly she sees it as her ethical duty towards another. And it doesn't consist, Nastasia's not capable of statistical analysis, the best way to help the greatest number of people, sociological understanding. It's not a grand theory of human happiness. It does not rest upon a system or even a theology. It's the simple prosaic attempt to love your neighbor as yourself, one cup of tea at a time. Last point about Nastasia, I think this is really the funny part. We don't know her, and we don't know what ends up happening to her. Right? Raskolnikov gets taken away into exile. Perhaps she's, and I sort of imagine she vanishes without a trace in the book, but somewhere she's offering cups of tea to her tenants and putting up laundry. Yeah. and so, but what my thought was, for Morson's God of onions, this is enough, right? She has done exactly what she needs to. Not all happy.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful to talk. Next, we have Denis from Vanderbilt, and you meet with. Would you prefer to do from those ones? So we're going to change it to. Just really fine without it. Oh, since I see some of the people who organized this wonderful conference, I want to begin by thanking everybody for putting it together and for inviting me to speak. Morson has described prosaics as a provocation. As such, the concept invites a polemic, granting that truth could exist outside of the immediate argument, though suggesting we search for it somewhere in the vicinity of the idea. In this paper, I would like to explore the periphery of prosaics by trotting several steps in the reverse on its intellectual path. My goal here is to return to the juncture where prosaics launches on its path, the place where it identifies the fundamental problem to which it then offers itself as a solution. I argue in this paper that prosaics is best understood as a response to a metaphysical crisis of modernity. It strikes me as a fundamentally modern notion, but I find the modern situation of prosaics to be deeply ironic. On the one hand, it rejects the modern metaphysic for its reliance on the linear, causal, progressive conceptions of reality. For prosaics, both history and plot are romantic delusions which misunderstand the fundamentally chaotic essence of time. On the other hand, prosaics wants to hang on to what is arguably modernity's most important achievement, an ethically responsible individual consciousness that preserves its integrity within the violent flow of time by means of an ethically responsible life. The challenge with the neo-Aristotelian modern conceptions of ethics for prosaics is that they are difficult to embrace without a prior acceptance of the narratival and therefore necessarily causal structure of reality. There is a reason Aristotle is the author of both Poetics and Nicomachean Ethics. Is it possible to renounce causality, yet hang on to an ethically coherent life? Prosaics responds to this question in the affirmative by advancing what I call small ethics. You can maybe use Epstein's poor ethics. What Morson eloquently calls moment-to-moment effort. This is not ethics in a strict metaphysical sense. There is no attempt to base moral living on any prior structure. Moral wholeness here is achieved by means of a total absorption in the mundane flow of small, random tasks and responsibilities. Process. The famous example of such unassuming ethical living in Dolly is Dolly Oblonsky in Anna Karenina, who for Morson best exemplifies the novel's prosaic virtues. Unlike Anna, who is wrapped up in the dramatic experience of her life and thus becomes abstracted from life and from morality, Dolly, quote, lives by constant attention to the prosaic details of daily life, especially those concerned with the most prosaic of institutions, the family, end of quote. Before Morson offers prosaics as a preferred reading of Anna Karenina, he carefully considers alternative possibilities. We find these possibilities in the following quote from Morson's article, Prosaics and Anna Karenina, and I brought that quote on the screen for convenience. Where plot is, true life is not. The opposite of plot, in the sense, is not idyllic contemplation, but constant work on a small scale. The ideal, like the drama, is a falsity. In this formula, we can discern four essential components, which for Morson all stand in an important relationship with each other. There is plot, idyllic contemplation or ideal, constant work on a small scale, this is what I dare to define as small ethics, and drama. Three of the four, plot, ideal, drama, are rejected as falsities. Meanwhile, constant work on a small scale, so smallness of it is really important here. We'll have to understand the importance of smallness, is elevated as that which constitutes the true basis of Tolstoy's novel, indeed of reality itself. It is impossible to overestimate the metaphysical ambition of the first claim, where plot is, true life is not. It undermines the very foundation of the modern literary theory, which is based on the Aristotelian assumption that plot is precisely how our imagination relates to life through imitation. For Aristotle, life can be meaningful to us only as a totality, and therefore our imagination creates this totality by endowing imitated life with a clear beginning and an ending. So bracketing out life into an image. For Prosaics, this approach is false because thus imaginatively construed totality could never capture how life truly is. True life never has a beginning or an end, but certainly not in any dramatic apocalyptic way, which is how Aristotle argues the ending happens in a story, right? It's an apocalyptic. It's not religious sort of apocalypse. It's not St. John's apocalypse. It's an apocalypse, nevertheless. Fantastic. Tolstoy's epilogue to Anna Karenina demonstrates that Anna's suicide does not end life. Life goes on. What expires in the novel is Anna's false rendition of her life as a dramatic plot. Anna's life ends only because it became a falsity. And falsity in life does not get to go on. Here it is worth repeating the question we have already asked of Prosaics. Can an individual life morally cohere without an experience of life as some sort of totality? For Prosaics, it can. Life becomes meaningful through total absorption in, quote, constant work on a small scale. You almost hear Chekhov's Uncle Vanya here, the end, Sonia's monologue, right, about work.
Yep.
Right? So, Uncle Vanya, we will go on. Yeah. We'll work for others now and in our old age without ever knowing rest. Something I don't think Chekhov sees this as a terribly enthusiastic way. Although perhaps in others won't. You know, maybe it's still Prosaics, just not. That's not as good of a news for Chekhov. That is for. Before offering itself as an alternative to plot, Prosaics considers other alternatives. There are two: ideal and drama. And my sense is that drama here can be used / tragedy, right? So in this Aristotelian sense of drama, the dramatic, the tragic. Although comedy must probably also could be incorporated into that. The reason why Prosaics considers this particular two ancient modalities is because they both are powerfully manifested in Anna Karenina. We find the idyllic mode prominently present in Lenin's part of the novel, and the dramatic in Anna's. And you could argue that then there is also interpolation. Certainly idyllic, and on Anna's side, maybe with Vronsky, and plenty of drama, of course, in Denis' life. Despite this prominent presence of ideal and drama in the novel, Prosaic rejects both of them as ultimately false. Why should we reject the ideal in Anna Karenina? After all, Dolly's miraculous ability to organize her family's life comes to fruition precisely in the country, where proximity to the peasant women and nature somehow, almost miraculously, brings her life together. Why should we not interpret this success of Dolly as idyllic and instead approach it through a more mundane idea of life in the country defined by Levin's difficult delight? Prosaic's answer is simple. Despite moments of rapturous unity with nature, life out in the nature, in the wild, simply ain't bliss. It's not blissful. Instead, it is, quote, drudgery, creativity, habit, and thought, end of quote. The task of life and the requirement of a happy marriage is not to seek bliss, but to remain moderately happy. And this moderate happiness is available only in total absorption in the everyday work. Maybe it is worth saying that by work, there's a very specific notion that Morson has. This is certainly not the Dickinsonian hell, factory work, or you almost get this, relaxed bourgeois kind of. You do it because you chose to, or something along those lines. But there's a manageable amount of work. Right? It's a very specific conception of labor. Nevertheless, ultimately, however, ideal is rejected on the premise like that of the plot. Namely, that it derives its coherence from its close to unity. If plot structures itself through the idea of time flowing linearly, I can't say that, from beginning to the end, the ideal is simply free from experience of flowing time altogether. It is blissfully unaware of time, and for Prosaics, that's not possible. Reality is fundamentally in time. We must reject drama for the same reasons as we rejected ideal and plot. Like the plot, drama relies on a closed, tight experience of truth, one that becomes available suddenly and in its entirety. It achieves this sudden emerging of wholeness by means of a rapturous interruption of time. This interruption leads to the abstraction from real life, where time cannot be interrupted. So again, same very similar reason for why drama or dramatic or tragic doesn't work. Time has been halted there, and that can't happen for Prosaics. I agree with Percival Morson that neither ideal nor tragedy can explain Tolstoy's novel, Anna Karenina. Neither modality received the ultimate validity. While there is no doubt that Tolstoy in truth in the novel gravitates towards the idyllic, it never quite reaches it. For example, we sense that Lenin's tranquility out in the nature will not last, and that anxiety is permeating his speech. I teach Anna Karenina every semester in one of my classes, and I always ask, because we just finished after, so I asked this question on Wednesday. I said, do you believe Lenin's happiness? And then I count how many people do. Nobody does. They don't trust these things. No, this guy is not, no way. So we cannot stick with the ideal. Similarly, I agree with Morson that Anna Karenina cannot be seen as a dramatic work, even though every production of Anna Karenina, of course, sees it as a dramatic work. Ballet, it's not a dramatic work. At least not in the classical sense. Despite the fact that Anna's death is not dissimilar to that of Nastasia Filipovna, and I'm making a comparison with the idiot here, Anastaski's novel, her drama is not nearly as absolute in the novel as it is in the idiot. Two contemporaneous novels. One I think must be thought as drama, or as a dramatic, tragic. And Anna Karenina, at least not in that sense, cannot be compared. There's a contrast here. Kitty, Dolly will go on living their lives and might even be reliably happy. No such happy lives are possible in the idiot, with Aglaya utterly destroyed by the whirlpool of Nastasia's tragedy. Although recently, I read a very interesting argument for why there is a happy life indeed, and that is by Levidus. Vera, Levidus door. The letters that she's beginning to send to Evgeny Pavlovich at the end is sort of a promise of a normal life, not the crazy ones are normal. I'm not sure I buy it, but it's an interesting argument for you to entertain. I don't think there's such life possible in a novel. And by the way, I have to confess that, of course, Morson couldn't agree with me that there is no parallel between Anna Karenina and Edith. There is a direct parallel. And Morson wrote a whole set of articles proving just that. It's called Pentax and Edith. If you are interested, there is this argument through rhythm and an approach. Prosaics hard to bring into the Edith, but in this very sort of creative approach through rhythm, Morson makes that argument. And since I disagree with it, I'll break it out. That discussion, I'll break it. While agreeing with Morson that neither ideal nor drama receives the ultimate authority in a novel, I want to suggest that we should preserve both. And certainly not dismiss them as falsity. On my reading, the structure of the novel is constituted by a fundamental tension between ideal and drama, unresolved tension. The parallel of Levin and Anna should be preserved, unresolved. I agree with Morson that it's unresolved, like a resolution, but I think it should be lived. By inviting us to preserve both the idyllic and the dramatic in a novel, tragic, I take my inspiration from Bakhtin's idea of the idyllic chronotope, which is based on the assumption that the modern novel is ultimately rooted in the genre of the ideal. For Bakhtin, the novel has always been an idyllic phenomenon, and it remains one even in the modern age. However, in the modern period, the ideal is no longer tranquil. It is a disturbed ideal, or even, as is the case with the 19th century novel, a disintegrated ideal. So, phrase. This disintegration reflects the deleterious effect of modernity on society, such as erosion of the family and corruption of the integrity of labor. So it's the note of Marxism here on the 19th. However, despite this profoundly corrosive effect of modern times on the ideal, for Bakhtin it remains vital. It continues to provide organic wholeness, hope to the modern experience. We almost get a sense that Bakhtin believes ideal to be ultimately invincible, capable of healing its body into wholeness, no matter the violence it has been subjected to. And I want to note that Bakhtin does see Rabelais as Rabelais' work as an idea, very much sort of a proper Renaissancean idea, right? It's that which is still medieval, but yet already aware of the modern. So in some sense, it's a broken ideal, a threatened ideal, but it's a broken body, that living body, and living body will always heal. So that's the idea. The field will always grow flowers. You might have to wait a season; it will happen. And so the ideal thus serves as this ground for everything else that is happening to the modern experience. Ideal's ability to resist total disintegration is linked to the memory of the tragic that the ideal has always preserved. The idyllic bliss is never ignorant for Bakhtin. Tragedy continues to live within the idyllic chronotope, even when it does not break out into drama. Bakhtin generally has it in the dramatic mode. But ideal for him doesn't, but that doesn't mean that it cannot be profound without becoming dramatic. An example of how tragic remains quietly but powerfully present in the ideal for Bakhtin are children. Their cheerful play always preserves the truth of childbirth, which is to say, the cycle of birth and death. And we must add, in light of Anna Karenina, death through childbirth as a possibility. One could argue that what makes Dolly so important to the novel is not so much that she is a good caretaker, although she is, but that she is a mother. It is easy to take Dolly's motherhood for granted in the novel, as simply that which generates for her the incessant flow of chores. In light of Bakhtin's idyllic chronotype, however, we must link her childbearing to that of Anna. To childbearing as such in the novel, not just hers, but as part of life that the novel captures. And that if that's true, that links her directly to Anna's childbirth. And if that's the case, then to Anna's near-death experience. And we are in the dramatic here, immediately. In some fundamental way, Anna's drama becomes Dolly's. A minute or two. Yeah, I'll get this. I wanted here to sort of remind you of that scene, famous scene on which, of course, much of Prosaics in Anna Karenina is based, and that is Dolly in the countryside. And there's this famous conversation Dolly has with peasant women. And then just in light of this talk, as we were reading with the class, I noticed that peasant women talk to her about death of a child. Mm-hmm. Right? And there's this very interesting moment where sort of what strikes us as, on the one hand, very mundane discussion of the death of a child. Oh, so what? My child died, and the old man got disappointed, but he got enough. Right? Sort of that type of talk. And there's no way that a reader is supposed to hear it as a mundane talk. Mm-hmm. Right? I mean, this is a profound talk, and it happens right on the eve of Anna's trip. I mean, for Dolly's trip to Anna, which I would argue is a culmination of her presence in the countryside. Right? So that's she's away from her chores. Right? She's now at on Anna's territory, and that's where the conversation about childbearing happens. Famous apology of Anna for why she's not planning to have any more children. My point here is that Dolly is right in the metaphysic of childbirth in the entire novel, which links Anna to past. So there's a continuum. It's not just her experience. And that's hard to think about childbirth in that novel in particular without the dramatic. And one final bit, if what matters about Anna, as Morson knows, is that she is Steve's sister. That's not a small connection that Garcon Morson makes. A wonderful connection because, of course, sibling bond, the most important bond in Tolstoy. But then we have to, by that very logic, say that if that is true, then it is also true that what matters about Dolly is that she's Kitty's sister. And there's, of course, a very famous death episode. It's the only section that's titled in the novel. It's called Death. And it is Kitty's taking care of the dying Nikolai. And then what we learn there, of course, is that, well, at least that's Tolstoy's take on it, that what allows Kitty to be put together, sort of next to a dying person while Levin is losing it, is that she's pregnant. That's what we learn. But for Tolstoy, again, we are in a metaphysic of childbirth and death, with brackets, everything else, and then on. I'm wrapping this up as quickly as I can. Anna's death is not the only death in the novel. Sometimes hard to remember that. There's Nikolai's death, there are other deaths there as well. We should ask the question in the conclusion, can death be approached prosaically? Is that a prosaic sort of thing? I would suggest that we cannot, even if death can and said left and happens prosaically. By its very definition, death seems to resist prosaically. And to accommodate that essence of death in Tolstoy and Karenina, and perhaps in life more broadly, it's worth preserving the tension between ideal and tragedy. Indeed, most of life will flow prosaically, But we do want to preserve the outer set of coordinates which silently but solemnly exert metaphysical pressure on life, helping it cohere into wholeness, into law. I'll leave that. Thanks.
We have about half an hour, yes, exactly, for questions and answers. Let's start with that, Susan.
Okay, I have three things and they're for both of you. And I want to apologize first that Anna, I missed the beginning of your talk, so I didn't hear what you were saying about Ferrari. I really apologize. So I'm gonna blame any incoherence or, dumb things and what I say on that. The first thing I want to do is caution both of you. They were fabulous talks, really, really interesting, very, very accomplished. But I really want to caution both of you about slipping into this easy discourse about modernity versus what came before, right? We all do this and we're all just following in the steps of all thinkers, but we really need to be much more cautious about it, right? Modernity is terrible because, what came before the family, here I'm going to go Bazarov on us, right? Bazarov and Pavel Pavlovich. What was the family like in the peasant commune, right? He says, I don't need to remind you about that. Labor, really, Denis? Are we going to idealize pre-modern forms of labor? And for both of you, just the brutality and the selfishness of pre-modern life. And, I'm going to here go Karl Mannheim and his book on Romanticism. The concept of medieval didn't exist until Romanticism brings that past to the level of reflection. And so I'm going to posit to both of you and to all of us in this room that our very concept, it's only modernity that gives us a Buber, right? It's like pre-modern people weren't sitting around being totally present to each other in perfect I-ish do situations, right? It's modernity that thinks that. And modernity is not thinking something that existed beforehand but was lost. It's something new. And it's only modernity that really, it was capable of generating this idea of this kind of being with each other. So that's really for all of us, something I'd like us to keep in mind. Then the second thing is, and I wish Saul were here for this, nobody wants to be Nastya and nobody wants to be Dolly. And it's like, I'm going to borrow from you, Anna, because your explication of Nastya's role was really enlightening. But it's like, if the ideal personality in Prosaics is the uneducated servant girl, and I'm going to go gender dimension here too, right? It can't be, it's like the mute serving woman who's kind of like, the ending of Oblomov, where Oblomov has gone back into this womb-like existence where the woman he marries is just like thrusting food at him. He's in a darkened womb-like room, and the wife is just thrusting pies and food in at him. I'm sorry, it's like, if Prosaics gives us Nastya and Dolly as our exemplaries, come on, let's cut the crap. It's like nobody wants to be Nastya, nobody wants to be Dolly. And Dolly, if we want to talk about respecting people as a means to an end, Dolly has been sacrificed. Like any Kantian is going to look at Dolly and say her individual person has been sacrificed as a means to an end for her children, for the family unit, right? That's not necessarily legitimate. So this is a challenge for all of us. Like, really, is this because Nastya? No. Dolly? No. Right? So we need to think beyond that. And then the last thing I want to say is, the God of the onions is not the spirit of the New Testament. The spirit of the New Testament is one of big dramatic acts. You leave, to say in that culture, don't go bury your father. To say in that community, you come follow me, don't go, you got to go bury your dead father, don't do it. That was a heck of a dramatic act. Or to say, leave your father and mother, hate your father, mother, your son, your wife, your brother. That is dramatic. So here, my quarrel is not with Saul about whether or not the spirit of Prosaics or the God of onions is like a good way to live, if there's value to it. But what I am contesting is that it is something that really we can derive easily, say, from the New Testament. And because I think that there is a very radical thrust to it, and I think this is something Tolstoy is a better Christian, right? He senses that the kind of radical, dramatic demands that Jesus puts on you. And again, with Prosaics, if our model, no one in this room is gonna model themselves on Nastya or on Dolly. So let's think about that. That's it.
So begin with responses. Panelists?
Okay, I'll start and then I'll let you take over work. So I should make clear that Bergad is not a nostalgic. So his critiques of modernity are always forward looking. And I don't know enough about Buber to say this categorically, but I think he himself was also that way. So in other words, we've gotten ourselves into a situation in modernity where objectification is real. The question isn't, are we going to go back? Because we're not, and neither of them, I mean, they were both rather, they were both very critical. For example, Bergyayev took a lot from the Slavophiles, but he was very critical of the idea that you could go back to their model. That was not possible. And I suspect the same for Buber. So the I thou is a modern solution to a modern problem, right? In other words, it isn't a nostalgic one. It's a in the moment. How do we get out of objectification? This is how we do it. So Anastasia, I hope, yeah. I mean, I guess you're right. You could get that out of my talk. She's the ideal, and maybe Morson sees that as the ideal. I think maybe the best way to the way I think of it is, okay, we won't hold her up as ideal, but we should discard her.
But the novel does, as you pointed out, the novel does discard her. That's very interesting. That hadn't registered with me before you said it.
Yeah, I can't get into Dostoevsky's head so much, but what I like about Morson, what he does with her is he rescues her from what we would all like to do with, I submit, lots of people in our lives, which is to say, oh, you're just the person who cleans my house, right? Like you don't, in other words, Morson's reading of Dostoevsky rescues insignificant people from their insignificance, not necessarily holding them up as heroes, but also if you think like even when you think about modern crises of social stratification and the rest of it, so many of us want to solve poverty, but we don't want to help there's a homeless guy who lives down the street from me who like is living in a sleeping bag on a corner. I'm happy to vote for the president that I think will solve poverty, and I mean, I'm saying this as a self-critique because I really haven't done anything about that poor guy. But I think that's just, we're called to rescue people from insignificance that we're tempted to when we think of systems. I hope that makes sense. Okay, and then the last thing is the God of Onions. Yes, the New Testament has the crucifixion, so you're absolutely right. Like, there's no way that only the God of Onions could prevail in this. So you're absolutely right about that. But there is the widow's mite in the New Testament and the Samaritan, right? So it is true that the God of Onions can't be the only thing in the world.
Right.
So maybe that's what you're saying. It cannot be that everybody is just doing prosaics, but I think where those passages are in the New Testament, and even in Saul's work, you don't even have to reference the New Testament. We need to get away. I think religion around the world, but particularly in this country, is obsessed with these big, heroic, who are we going to elect for president questions, rather than the very simple prosaic ones. And I think it's a cautionary tale for all of us that we want to think and dream big. We're not thinking and dreaming small. Do you want to?
I'll jump in very briefly, maybe on let's not dismiss my journey. I'm deeply sympathetic with that mission. I'm not really good at it, but I do think that's generally a good good attitude to have, and I do think that that's actually what prosaics born out of. In some way, prosaics, at least the way I read it, strikes me as a bit of a desperate is probably too strong. Carol will correct me, but it is fundamentally a reaction to what prosaics, I think, senses to be a pretty serious problem on our hands with modernity. I didn't talk about this simply because I didn't have time, but maybe I'll throw it in here since Carol is here, she can correct me. But the book where Prosaics, of course, begins, in Gareth Watches the book called Lewis Carroll, and that is Creation of Prosaics in Bakhtin. And that book for me really picks up two massive fights. It's a combative book, and it's as you know, good books often are. It picks up two big fights. Both are schools of reading Bakhtin, which Prosaics doesn't like. One is, of course, the whole Marxist Bakhtin debate. I'm not going to say much about this. It's a big sort of separate conversation. But the other one, surprising, and it was a surprise to me when I read as a graduate student, it actually begins to argue an unthinkable for Bakhtin, and that is that carnival doesn't matter. That it's almost a bad thing. It's like, what do you have left in Bakhtin if there's no carnival? Then you begin to read carefully and you realize, and especially if you begin to read carefully Bakhtin himself, you realize that the carnival that we have here in our hands that the book argues against is not really Bakhtin's carnival, but it is the way Anglo-American tradition has understood carnival. And so it's really arguing against the implementation of carnival in the rhetoric, which essentially became a license for relativism. The idea that basically all metaphysical structures are now are melting away. The world is a mess, there's no plot, and who cares, right? And Prosaics says, oh, we do care, okay? This doesn't matter. And so we need to hang on, and that's what in my paper I sort of discussed under this. We need a morally wholesome entity. Right? How do we preserve it when metaphysical structures are not there? And essentially, I think Dolly, Garfield Morson Dolly, is really in confrontation not so much with the ideal or with drama, but with relativism from the Prosaics book, from Bakhtin's book. So it's Dolly against wrong carnival, really. And an insistence on the fact that no, relativism cannot be the way forward, right? It almost is a product of modernity. That's the challenge. That's the challenge, and I don't think it's a small challenge, and I don't think it's an illusion of a challenge. I think it's a real challenge.
Oh, yeah. A couple of people responding, and then there were a couple of additional questions. So we'll start.
Yeah, this is going to be bad because there's three wonderfully smart things. What Susan said, what Anna said, and what Denis said. Let's answer quickly about Carnival. I think Saul and I were harsh on Carnival in 1990. Didn't understand what it was for Bakhtin. Bakhtin loved it, felt the crucifixion was Carnival, and he believed the Carnival spirit was akin to the Holy Spirit. Now, when Denis asked earlier, can that be approached prosaically? You bet, from a Carnival perspective. But that means you cannot trace individual people. You trace the life force. Every woman who dies, especially if she's an old hag, is pregnant. That's the Carnival scenario. You cannot grieve indefinitely individual people that die. Now, the second point I wanted to make, just in connection with Susan and Anna here, is Nastya the maid in Raskolnikov's boarding house and in that novel discarded? Discarded. Her story isn't carried through by the author. That means nothing. Saul's famous for making these marvelous points, as you know, when he says Dolokhov's mother in the middle of War and Peace. Dolokhov's a scoundrel, a seducer, a gambler, a cheat. But somehow we found out that when he is finally wounded in a duel with Pierre, that he has this mother and this crippled sister that he's been wonderful to. We didn't know about it. We're not going to know any more about it. And the point there, which Saul makes beautifully in his book on Tolstoy, is that novels exist to tell you that not all stories can be told. So stop thinking you know everything just because an author wrote you one version of that story. So I think that way you can sort of have it both ways. People aren't cast out. Their story isn't told, and their reality exists beyond their story.
And then you're
I'll try to be brief. This is again about Nastasia. For Nastasia, on in response to your comments, but let me couch it as a response to Saul Morson, or I think it's actually not Saul Morson. It's some of the ways in which Saul has inspired people to read Russian literature, which I'm going to be critical of in a way, as a person who is in the field. Namely, if you look at Nastasia, she is indeed kind. She is an socially insignificant person who is kind and performs what I'm sure Dostoevsky looks on as acts of Christian charity. She's almost too consistently kind. she's speciously kind. The reason is, there's another way of explaining why she is that way, is that she belongs to a series of characters in the novel who are kind because they are peasants and they are not from the city. The policeman Raskolnikov gets to help the girl who's being accosted, kind of Gardetsky Boulevard. Mikulka, the painter, who confesses without having committed any sin crime. They're in the conceptual economy of that novel. They're doing this because they are not of this horrible modern city, St. Petersburg. They are peasants who come from the countryside. It is about the equivalent of a novel set in Los Angeles, where all the Mexican help are good characters. Now, wonderful, they're granted some measure of significant humanity, but it's also condescending. And in a Russian historical perspective, it is perhaps nefarious, idealizing the peasantry. There are other peasants, which Dostoevsky is certainly aware of. I mean, they murdered his father, but there are other peasants who are not like this. So Nastasia is a more complex character than I think simply a person who renders a small act of Christianity.
Okay. I'm gonna push back a bit. Yes, I'm very aware. So when I teach crime punishment, the binary is always present, right? City, bad, peasant, good. So that's sort of everything, and I think it even at one point says, everyone who comes to the city suddenly becomes corrupted, right? So even if they were good before, it ruins them from within. And so, yes, I suppose you could see her as of the peasantry and then fitting very neatly into this binary. However, I have another thing. I didn't have time to talk about it. I think she knows he murdered the old woman. And despite that, won't getting in, which adds that extra little layer of cunning. And so her goodness is goodness. I would submit she's not as simple as we want to think of her, because there's that moment, right, where he's about to go kill the old woman and he sees her doing the laundry, right? And she looks at him in this very, and he, that could be a product of his guilt, she's just looking at him. There's always that sense that she gets it, right? Which would then add an extra layer, right? She's clever, but she's still there. Again, Dostoevsky's vision of Natalia and Morson, I would argue, are different, potentially. I am celebrating for my own purposes Morson's attitude towards her. What Dostoevsky's might have been, I'm a little loath. I mean, it's part of what, as you suggest, I think quite rightly, part of a whole web and complex of kind of quasi-Slavophile ideas, and she's embedded. I will agree with you.
And is there any other textual evidence that makes you think she knows about the murder besides the fact that she had that moment of looking at
He
him?
clings to that, but it's like she says, "Oh, look, you have blood all over your hands," right? You remember that? He's got like clutching this fuzz, bloody thing. She's like, "What's that?" Right?
Mhm.
And then she quickly makes it into a joke. It's like, "Oh, you're like a kid holding on to." Yeah, again, like, could I conclusively prove it? But there was something a little bit funny about how she constantly is sort of making jokes, sort of not making jokes. Why is the policeman here? But not giving anything away. That made me think she's a bit deeper than just a background passive. Oh, by the way, I have to say, any mistakes about nostalgia are my own, they're not Gary's. This was my Morson reading of, not Morson reading himself, so please don't blame him. How could you possibly think nostalgia was like this? And he didn't write.
So thank you for those two wonderful talks. I have questions for both of you, and I'll try to go quickly. So the first, maybe for Denis, is it seems to me that the idyll, tragedy, and prosaics are they're different categories of things. So to me, it seems that tragedy is not an attempt to describe reality. It's in a very rational city like Athens. They need every year, once a day, to act out all the horrible things that they can't integrate into their lives as a way of pursuing wisdom. And so you have the festival of Dionysus as a way of treating what your society can integrate and becoming aware of it.
Mm.
For the idyll, it's all the things, it's also not a description of life. It's a description of what we could hope to return to or hope for. Whereas prosaics is an attempt to be describing life. So then the question is, it seems that Tolstoy is using, because he wants to figure out in Russian society what it can integrate and what can destroy it. So he's using the tradition of tragedy to figure out whether this society can survive. He's using also the tradition of the to see if there's something to hope for. So it seems, so I just want to know
Who is he?
Tolstoy in Anna Karenina. So my question to you then is it a question of the prosaics not turning away? So I'm wondering, is prosaics capacious enough to include the idyll and the tragedy, not as descriptions of life, but as processes that are crucial, right? So I think that might be totally in tune with what you were saying. And so my other question, yeah, okay, so just wanted to hear you talk a little bit about the difference, that they're just categorical differences here. And then for Anna, I know we're running out of time, but I probably everybody in this room has a lot of conversations these days. I hang out with a lot of dads because I have kids. Dads, because of where I live, they're in tech. They're crazy about AI, and there's like two kinds of dads that I meet. There's one that loves AI and wants it to be better than us, and they're weirdly excited about that. They everything ask AI to do stuff, and these usually tend to be overpowered husbands. It's not fair. Well, maybe that's why. Okay, and then the other one is the person who is in tech, loves the idea of AI, but is worried about it. And they both predict that we're going to be totally obsolete. And then it's my job as somebody in humanities who's into personalism to make the argument to them, no, this is not the case. That's not how human intelligence works. That's not what you have a very small idea of intelligence. And then their response almost always is, your description of what humans are doesn't correspond to my experience of how humans are. Right? I see us as processors. So I want to hear your talk because it folks so beautifully against Harari and against this kind of mechanical model of the human being. Prosaics, I don't know if it can answer that question, because what is ChatGPT but Nastasia? I mean, that's what Nastasia is to these, in a sense, all these little deeds that it's constantly doing. I'm just trying to be harsh here, right? I don't know if that's the case, right? And then, oh, wait, I got lost on that point. Maybe that's enough. But the idea that I lost the last point, but maybe I'll just stop there. You know, I'd like to hear you talk a little bit in terms of Jayef, in terms of Buddha, because this morning it was interesting. Sol said, it's I, it, and that's no good. And then Epstein said, if I, you, there's a subjectivity there.
Yeah.
So we're kind of having this discussion already, and I think you have something to say.
No, you go ahead.
Uh,
Oh, right. No, I think that's perfect.
It's a big question. It's to make it short. I just think that I don't think prosaic disagreement with I. I call it ideal. I don't know. You called it idyll. Idyll is what you say. I went to the philosopher and said, "How do you say this word?" They said, "Ideal." Idyll and prosaic disagrees with idyll and tragedy, not simply sort of it's not a degree difference, but it's not that idyll and tragedy are just more ambitious and they can, as you said, process more. And I think Garson Morson interested in, for example, drama here, precisely in just that Chekhovian moment, how dramatic makes it wholeness, right? The moment, singularities, times and stuff. Aha. Right? And that's just, it's not compatible with how prosaics insists truth manifests itself. It's like gravitating from point to point to point to point without a dramatic breakup. And so the disagreement, in some sense, I would say prosaics is a postmodern notion in a way. Right? It's pretty pessimistic about reality. So I think it's basically trying to gather together this crowds thing. You know, let's think of a wholesome life given, and then metaphysically it accepts sort of what I would describe as wholesome physical reality.
Well, Denise, when you were talking about work, the process, like you don't have any bigger picture or plot and it's just the task at hand, I was thinking of psychosis, right? Or like schizophrenia, because seriously, like that is the lack of like the bigger picture, right? When you're just like, what's right in front of me and this lack of being able to think about metaphor and plot and so on. So, yeah.
Okay, so I'll be quick about ChatGPT. So yes, actually, the book that I'm writing on Gurdjieff is in part to response called, my brother's in tech. So every time I go to Silicon Valley, I hear, we're just machine, ChatGPT is just us. So we just, suck in data and spit it back out. So in that sense, ChatGPT is us. And to me, that's an old debate. One that would benefit from looking at what people say about it, and one of them is Gurdjieff, that also the whole interwar French ecumenical discussion about what a human being is, right? I actually wrote, not a plug, but I wrote a tiny little article in a tiny obscure journal on ChatGPT, which I called the Golden Calf, because to me, it reminded, and so it reminded me of the Old Testament, and it also reminded me of Marx. Marx used to always say, we create an economic system and then we subject ourselves to it, right? So in other words, we create capitalism and say, well, what can we do with capitalism, right? And I think that's what we've done with AI. We have created it. We have inputted ourselves into it. We are the ones who are interpreting what it spits out, but then we're saying, oh, wow, we just have to follow what it says, and so it just seems to me like we've lost our sense of agency with that. So we are peeps, we are persons, and I think that's why Morson said this something interesting. We are the persons who are creating it and interpreting what it spits out. Because when it spits out poetry, it's not interpreting the poetry. We're reading the strings of words and putting meaning to it. Because the human endeavor. Sorry, I got on my soapbox. But that's so the reason I wanted to write the Gurdjieff book was precisely this, to get back to discuss what is the human person. Because when I say, persons matter, a lot of you in this room are like, yeah, of course persons matter, but there's a lot of people out there who don't think they do. And that's why I used Ferrari as my example. And they're very popular and they're very famous.
So we've got 4 minutes left until the break starts. So maybe Mike, we can answer the question, and people can maybe start gently going into break. And Paul, I know you also have a question as well. So we can go. Let's maybe do that.
Not go gently into that.
I guess as far as Susan's point to add to your point about the radicality of the New Testament, it's not money in particular, right? The attitude is money, which is like it's not like you just have money and do nice things. Today would we do this, right? And the reality are manifesto for the God at the same time, right? That is
What was the manifesto for what?
the God abundance, the downtrodden, the forgotten, the weak, the lowly, right? And so both, again, you got this up in there, responsible for both are definitely there. I was gonna just add a couple of maybe points to get about a smaller end. Do you remember that there's one person in the novel in Brothers Karamazov that's kind? There's Paul. Do you remember who that is? Because it's
Mariah, for one thing. I mean, well,
Maria
plays guitar.
it's kind of like it's just hot for him,
Okay, yeah,
but not
never mind.
Marfa Ignatievna, right? Grigori's wife. He's the one who Smirnikov says this is the one person who's been kind to me from now on. And there's, if we could say, I agree with Tom's point that we have to be careful about, well, okay, she's also a peasant. And she doesn't have a choice in a way, but I don't know, there's a way in which she's much more complicated, and no one's been able to convince me that actually the monster child that appears is not Fyodor Karamazov's. To this point,
I think
so
that's right.
I think it's a real possibility that we'd have to consider at least. And so I don't know, she's complex in her own way. But then just lastly, as far as Dimitri's pillow, which I think is a lovely moment, I think that that could, in a way, be the formation of the altar to the god of onions, and I mean it in this sense. Dimitri is lying down. Remember, he's lying down on a treasure chest, and there's rug over it, and so it's like basically, if you pull back the curtain at the altar in the Orthodox Church, that's what you'll see. Right, is a square chest with a rug over it, and he's sleeping on it, right? And then he has this dream, and the dream is about the little ones, right? And what are we gonna do about the little ones? And he wakes up, and there's a pillow underneath him, and it's nobody's pillow, but it's everybody's pillow, sort of, right? It's the invisible act of kindness that is good to him. And, you know, just like Jacob, who when Jacob has this dream and wakes up, he creates a hallowed space. This is now the foundation for the temple, right? It's in a way like the formation of a temple for the god of onions in Dimitri's case, right? I don't know if that, what you would make of that, but it just occurs to me that that's kind of maybe even a better example than we give it credit for. And then very quickly, Dennis, I just want to ask, just as a point of clarification, how, let's see, how does the constant work on a small scale not belong to a plot? That is, unless we're viewing plot as just kind of like has a beginning, middle, and end. I would still think that in order to understand constant work on a small scale, we'd have to, that's an aesthetic arrangement. It has meaning, you know, it's prosaic, and it connects to a larger plot, right? So I just, how.
That's a question for Gareth Morson, of course, because that's his client, not mine. But I would be closer to your reading here, saying that it like with the little job I had for religion, right? It's for it's ethics. It's just afraid of that fact, and because it's also smart enough to be aware of the postmodern implications of the ethical. Right? So it's an attempt to solve it by means of just like tuning it down a little, right? Calling it small ethics, just like trying to have religion when you don't really, right? And calling it poor religion. Is that how legitimate it is metaphysically speaking? That move, I'm not sure. You know, has it really escaped the linearity? I would say that's even more interesting question for guys more so with tempics.
Exactly.
Because if you take a rhythm only possible in rhythm is not possible really in a not tight, right? That's a rhythm. That's why poetry is ultimately rhythmical. It relies on a very rigid structure. And so if we are going to take a rhythm seriously, it's called tempex, not rhythmics, right? But it's close to that, right? And if we're going to take tempo and musicality seriously here, and tempex time, then we are in a very close predicament as with small ethics. So tempex, it's small rhythmics, you see? Right.
No, okay, thank you so much. Half-hour break, and then there will be another session here, as well as another session back in, No, that's not, I think that's the. This is fine. They all keep an eye
So it's right. You pointed to think about how we can start out what is the forms of my investing
about you are.
Yeah.
Well,
So, no.
Think about that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Go back and
Sorry. Fine. Good to see you. How are you? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I gotta find out where appointment. By the way, really.
So whether
I mean,
it's
the thing
Walter
is-
or God, I do have.
Okay, great.
A lot of it's going over.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Assuming you're not lying to us.
I'm not lying, but I'm right. Yeah.
We have versions of that.
Because now.
So there are visitors popcorn, I don't know. Supposed to suggest.
Quite a while.
Yeah,
And great to see you. We're talking. Yes.
No, good, Mark. Yeah. What's the
That's not my area, but get this.
Yeah.
Yes.
I know who he is, I hold the door.
Great guy.
You didn't know because.
You know, one thing that isn't true. Alter of Christ is not. As we think about it, the massive.
Super.
Every time there is. Leave your mother. Give up everything.
Still. Both. That's true.
I mean, the
And so when you come to these, like the young man who's done all, what more?
They already.
Say hello when you're.
Yeah, I will. comes in. Right? Like, I'm thinking this is quite interesting that the idea that large.
She and I.
Yeah, but so it's ambiguous, right? Like, you know.
I think.
Yeah, I think that's what I was, that was my.
I really like. And even
Oh, it's just like, you want to be a follower, this is what you have to do. You want to be my follower, like, imagine that, have a lot of, you can't just become sharing, you have to give to people.
That's actually not the commandment of Christ. That is a response to individuals how they can be saved. And it's an example that must be taken in a larger context. But it's the Christ that
Sorry.
I know.
Oh, you see somebody who's very careful. The easy, mundane, everyday, unmasked qualities are the foundation of salvation.
I know, I mean.
The difficult path is taken by not
Struggling.
bearing the light load, right? Choosing to have to put more on the back when those difficulties are taking the monastic path too, is for not everyone.
Whoever doesn't like hate their father and their mother, everything on my state, like, I really think there's a general statement like that.
But it's a
Yeah, no, it's
response
been delightful.
to
And I
someone
was talking with Morty.
specifically in a position who was attempting, who was finding out a deeper mode of attachment.
I'm gonna go back and
Who
look.
it turns out he's known for years, but.
I'm gonna, because I feel like it's more of a universal enjoiner, but I'm sure you know it better than me.
Yeah, no, but I mean, but it's, and that's the weird, that's the paradoxical nature of it too, because it is both simultaneously very specific.
Yeah.
Man.
Because like when he says, you know, let the dead bury the dead, that's not someone looking for more, that's someone saying, I wanna follow you, but I need
That's
to
the,
bury
and
my
that's one of
body.
the people who are the apostles, who he knows can bear that load too, which I think is an interesting part of how.
My pastor on the Missouri Synod.
Oh, you want to guess where I taught? I taught at Valparaiso.
My mom graduated.
Why don't you say?
I taught at, I love that place. I taught at Christ College, the honors.
My brother just sent me a link, there's a.
Yes, believe me, I signed it. I
I
signed
signed
two
it too.
petitions now.
My
Yeah.
brother said, here, if you want to sign this.
Yeah.
It's interesting, if you want to sign here it is. And I wrote back, he said, Mom.
On your TV, you got that.
Music and theology, and I'm Catholic, and I was like, it's like a part of the Lutheran. Yeah. No. So the pastor, and your Lutheran church used to work at the bookstore.
So I think the story of my pastor, from what I've gathered from a few things he's
Right.
said, is he was raised Catholic.
Right.
As son, and was at one point going to become a priest.
Oh,
No,
Did not
that's
become
the
a
way it
priest.
is.
So the end of the story is he, without going through the Lutheran seminary, I was one of the two Missouri Synod seminaries. None was somewhat qualified to become a pastor.
Yeah.
Church. In between, had a secular career, and he managed the
Yeah.
bookstore at Pepperdine.
that's so
So,
funny.
you know,
Wow, that's great. We'll tell an old Valpo guy. Who,
I will.
Old says hello, even though I didn't know him when he was at Pepperdine. And, it's wonderful talk. No, it's a small world, but, yeah, I hope Valpo gets through it.
Oh, just, sometimes I think that presidents are basically playing checkers, so they do these things. And with their board of trustees, and then they trigger this kind of response, which then can take to the trees, but you never know. That's really up to
I don't know. It was did you read the New York Times story about they're going to sell the George O'Keeffe paintings? No, and they have this gorgeous library. Have you been on the campus?
No, I've never been to that.
Yeah, I lived there, so long. I was in the Midwest for 20 years, but Valpo 12, and they have this George O'Keeffe and some other private things. Someone pretended to need to build donuts and six days. And it's like part of the soul of the place. I mean, that's partly why the museum is such a jewel. University.
Lord.
Yeah. But anyway, I'm glad it's break time. When is our next?
3:30, and I'm in this room,
Good.
so.
Oh, you are, good.
Yeah.
I'm not sure where I'm supposed to go at this point. I know I should go to the restroom.
Yeah.
I know that much.
It's downstairs, yes.
Good talk.
I already have been there, I can tell you.
Tom,
it's
one thing I want to
downstairs.
say, though, meet Albertson, because just the fact that you're like a resource
It's
you love Albertson. He's a religious and serious guy, and he's very smart.
I know who he is, and we had a graduate student who was his PA.
Yeah, okay.
Something directly before us
Yes,
on the,
yes.
I was just doing.
Right,
So
right.
I will seek him out.
Do seek him out, yeah, good. See you again soon.
You got Paul.
Okay.
Well, there's a photo here, actually.
So I think,
Guys.
I'm going to invert the request. I'll be right back.
Yeah.
Oh, no, that's it.
Oh. I'm sorry, let me see where you're talking about. You're the next. No, I'm not. Well, there's either where we were, where we are, so. We'll be in session. So you're so that's back. No, that's back.
I gotta go. Everyone's going down.
Yeah. Let me know how it is. No, it's, yeah, I'm just moderating.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, I'm actually not presenting at this conference other than tomorrow morning, just on the floor. Okay. Always just.
It's just talking about. Go get it. Okay, yeah. I should have listed my little essay first.
Oh, you're right, yes.
When the dog was led by
Oh, do you know what's? That's. So it's not on here. So this is actually what you want to run. If this is the first person that's gonna present. It is. It's not me to do anything right now. Well, I can say. The tab again, every time you hit tab, the tab. So. Anyway.
It's hard to say his name, but he was wondering if he could talk amateur before he's before he was. Yes.
one over there.
Okay.
I thought mine.
Yeah, you're coming back here, right?
Yes, I,
Yeah.
oh, yeah.
Oh, fine.
Okay, I'll be right back.
Okay, let me do some.
For that,
I want to stay.
Oh, there's even a sign. I love signs. It must be here, isn't it? Logic is just. It's soft chair.
But I did. Tension, functions, and a. New way that's still taking his attention. That's what you could say, given that much of the novel is also is very, very wordy. Yes, rant against words. Yeah. Using a steampunk as a rant against technology, would have that, it's probably parallel that the author's not, or whatever you call this, the author is, not aware of. Yeah. But that is a, that would be a good for yeah.
Hi, Steve Black. Peter, nice to meet you. How are you doing? Good. So I suppose we'll go in order. That's awesome. So,
yeah, that would be a second, right?
yes, if we've got the positive.
Okay, great. And as far as the PowerPoints go,
It should, did you email to PowerPoint to someone?
Yeah, I did.
Earlier, okay, it should be on this computer. There will be someone here who's purely doing
so
that.
I'm gonna be, okay, so we'll have
We can
total
scoot
control
this
over
on
it.
this,
Yeah, I'm gonna be reading from I'll be needing to advance
Yeah.
and maybe go backwards.
Yeah.
And also read my paper from my computer.
I don't know if there's another putting or if there was enough room.
Yeah, nice trying.
You can move that laptop down. I don't know who's better.
I think it's the request. It's the.
Yeah, there might be another option, because the question will be, does this go with this, or is that?
Let's see.
At one point, I think that was projecting the image of the speaker.
It is still, actually, we're still,
Okay, so when I come, I can put this down and I can do the buttons from
As
here
long-
and I can
yeah.
have my talking.
we'll see what Dimitri wants to do with.
Alright.
Great, Dimitri's doing PowerPoint, you're doing PowerPoint. I come last and I'm not doing PowerPoint, everybody's like fall asleep.
Don't get sleep on mine, you want to don't worry about it.
I've got a couple of really great templates. You could run it up. I'm not.
I'll do our-
We chatted, but very.
We have lots of chocolate and lots of coffee in the bag.
Yes, people are encouraged to. Right there.
Oh, I took somebody else.
Oh, awesome. What a great idea.
Interesting. This is not even mine. Well, mine's already in my bag.
Do you want to read my paper?
I like things in general. Can I steal your folder? Kind of. Very good.
Don't think coffee's.
I was hoping you were
All
gonna.
the scribblings, crossings out,
Uh-huh.
that's my paper.
Hoping you were.
It's on paper,
Wing it.
you're not only delivering PowerPoint, you're reading.
I am, I'm reading off the screen.
See, I'm very, very old school.
Well, it's not, yeah, it's becoming old school. I think last summer was the first time, and the most recent instance was the first time I noticed that, yeah, the majority of people are reading off their computer now. It's pretty specific.
One of the really rare person who's also been cutting over this. Oh, you gave a talk.
So your PowerPoint is
smart.
is already
I said,
ready.
the next time
It'd be easier to
Yeah.
move this computer down like this.
Yeah.
Somehow that's
It's okay, it doesn't feel a little, it's a little disconcerting, you know, yeah.
was.
It's a reading.
Conversions. Like the
Sorry,
graphics.
And the
Or
of
actually, let's see if this.
guy running the whole thing.
Oh, no, this.
You know,
So
as a
speaking
wife,
of-
as a wife, you know,
Yeah,
do you want to get together with the other
Okay,
other wives who are attending, you know, do you want to do any of these things?
Oh,
And I said,
Yeah.
No, I hate
Yeah.
people that like to be alive.
Yes,
Yeah,
or
we could-
that's it.
We still have
Yeah.
to.
Yes, it will be one of those things, one or 2 days.
Do you want to do anything?
Or, I don't know, but I just.
I was literally basing entirely on whether you want to do any of the things.
Really don't think that there's a
Usually keep
project.
15 to 20
aspect to
students
this.
well
No.
entertained. Same by town.
Where is this thing being held?
Tucson.
They're not banging my doors down.
So that's.
Could you just say you were busy at the spot and you couldn't.
When I was
possibly
at
do it, yeah.
Cornell, the graduate school.
Getting my
I-
nails done,
Well, of
yeah,
course, I
Every day.
every day, all the time.
And it was a course that was, I think, listed as you could do this with both graduate and under. So I put me. It's taught by artificial course and recently. And every week there were a few hundred people.
So Tim, do you keep in touch with many people? You must, I would say suggest.
It was Socratic, it's wonderful.
Yes.
You know, what
Let's
it's like,
see.
it's like reading everything Hobbit wrote without.
Of people in those cities, I don't think every once in a while I see Michael like there.
Yeah.
And nice to sort of.
I can do that.
Yeah.
Not really.
Yeah, it's quite a bit for me.
So I just simply say something
Years,
small.
but then I think he, yeah. It's, well, if we could track it in the hundreds to start, and we'd have a
Yeah.
stuff like that. It's
Something they do.
So,
I think also say this.
we went to even some very pretty professionals, you know, here though.
Do they? Is that
Still,
really?
Yeah.
it's still.
I think it was-
Other than that, I've seen.
We're still going on.
Yes.
Okay. I didn't pause it already.
Yes, it is.
Pretty professional.
Heather, can you have your slides?
Salisbury.
Yeah.
It's great.
Okay.
Yeah.
I talked to Spring relatively recently. Yeah, then you jobbed her.
But he's got good.
Welcome everyone. Thank you all for being here. This is panel 5, and we're going to have 3 presentations today. The first is Dmitry Buryukov from the Free University of Berlin, and
Thank you. For my English. Okay, so in the article on the list theoretical exploration in the field of apocalyptic language published in 1922, Shtapovanov refers to Pushkin as a name glorifier. In my presentation, I'm to delve into the background of this topic as well as explore the theme of contrast between Pushkin and Tolstoy, which were characteristic of the Russian symbolist movement. So in 1999, Shtapovanov authored an article titled on Pushkin's Gypsies, where he highlights Pushkin's depiction of gypsy people. Ivanov notes that in embracing the female archetype as the essence of gypsies, Pushkin associated is with the name Mariula. The choice of the name Mariula by Pushkin as a representation of a gypsy woman wasn't arbitrary. The phonetics of this name and with the phonetics of the entire poem reflects the very essence of the gypsy spirit. This refers to Pushkin's skill as a poet who creates based on phonetic inspiration, resulting in the mysterious melodiousness of his works, according to Ivan. These reflections of Shtapovanov serve as one of the foundations for the Russian theory of symbolism developed by Ivanov and Zhernokyeyev, where Pushkin was considered as one of the principal representatives of symbolism. Also, these reflections influenced, for instance, Pavel Florensky's doctrine on the magical power of proper names, and the previous picture is from Florensky's papers. In the 1910s, Ivan published a foundational article, The Testaments of Symbolism. Several key ideas from this article are also reflected in his earlier text, The Poet and the Rabble, published in 1904. Within these works, the figure of Tютчев assumes an even greater significance than that of Pushkin. Ivanov asserts that in Tютчев poetry, Russian symbolism is firstly created as a consistently used method. This method lies in a dual artistic vision, encompassing within poetic art both the sensory world and the transcendental world. However, Ivanov's perception of Tютчев is itself marked by duality. He views Tютчев as both the first Russian poet who employed the symbolic method and as a writer whose work demantles the symbolistic universe. The latter is linked to Tютчев's pivotal poem Serenity. The program articulated by Tютчев in this verse quoted the inherent isolation of the human being, the impossibility of profound human connection. From Tютчev's perspective, the program embodies the tragic situation of the modern rupture between the artist and the people to whom they belong, a situation that symbolism seeks to remedy. In contrast, Ivanov argues the true poet should act as a hierophant, conveying a hieratic speech on divine matters to the people, thereby explicating that which resides within the depths of the folk soul itself. Using this line of reasoning, Ivanov distinguishes between two forms of speech. On the one hand, this everyday speech referring to empirically given external objects, and on the other, a poetic and hieratic speech referring to the transcendental revealed through inner experience. In the case of the rupture between the artist and the people as manifested within the Tютчевian poetic universe, the transcendental realm remained nameless, unable to find expression from within the speech of the sensory world. Ivanov's argument suggests that the Tютчевian spoken thought, which is alive, is a thought about the transcendental expressed in everyday speech and not in the hieratic symbolistic language. In contrast, Pushkin exemplifies a poet who still remembers his true vocation to be a theologist in the art of poetry. This is manifested through Pushkin's linguistic sensitivity, as seen in particular in his Gypsies, where he names the woman who embodies the very essence of the Gypsies, Mariupa. Thus, among the theorists of symbolism and opposition emerged Pushkin versus Tютчев. I will miss my thought about Mandelstam because I don't have enough time. Okay. Then the Yugoslavia, or name refined movement, enters the scene, originating in the Russian monasteries on Mount Athos during the 1900s. Among ordinary monks, the Yugoslavia movement flourished in the 1910s and 1920s among Russian thinkers such as Antony Blatovich, one of those atomic monks, Pavel Florensky, Sergei Bulgakov, and others. Following 1930 13th, these thinkers embraced, elaborated upon, and conceptualized the initially rudimentary Yugoslavian doctrine of the Catholic monks within philosophical and theological discourse. Proponents of Yugoslavia accepted that a Christian, while contemplating and invoking God's names, primarily through the so-called Jesus prayer, participates in God Himself. Therefore, the names of God, when uttered and contemplated by an individual, are understood to be God Himself. During the Yugoslavian debates, proponents of Yugoslavia sought arguments to support their position within Byzantine theology. In this context, Antoni Blatović, one of the leaders of the Yugoslavian movement, turned to the Ptolemaic doctrine, which has been largely forgotten within Russian church at the time. The doctrine distinguished between the unknowable essence of God and his noble energies. While Blatović wasn't deeply engaged with philosophy and academic theology, the Ptolemaic line within Yugoslavia was taken up and developed by Pavel Florensky, one of the most prominent theologians of that time. The strategy employed by Blatović and Florensky involved identifying the names of God with the divine energies in the Ptolemaic sense. Consequently, the unconventional name verifying formula, the name of God is God Himself, which has been a source of controversy, was transformed into the conventional Ptolemaic formula, the energy of God is God Himself. In the early stage of the Yugoslavian debates, ordinary monks named glorifiers, while asserting that the name of God is God Himself, emphasized the presence of God within the created world and His knowability. This stance drew criticism from opponents of Yugoslavia. The integration of Platonism into the Yugoslavian discourse, keeping in mind Ptolemaic emphasis on the unknowability of the divine essence, yet the knowability of divine energies, brought balance to the Yugoslavian doctrine. Now it appears that God is accessible and knowable through His name's energies, while remaining unknowable in His essence. According to the testimony of Vyacheslav Ivanov's daughter Lydia, Ivanov personally interacted with and befriended the monks named verifiers in the Caucasus region in 1916. In a letter to Prague, Ivanov enthusiastically described his encounters with these monks who preached about the possibility of attaining inner paradise through invoking the divine name in prayer. So Ivanov was familiar with the details of the Yugoslavian doctrine. Unsurprisingly, Yugoslavia found its place within his writings. Now we'll see how. So, the theme of contrasting Pushkin and Tolstoy also emerged in the works of Ivanov and Andrei during the late of 1910s and early 1920s. In the Poetry of the World and the Road of Aaron, 1970s, we see the nature of Tolstoy's poetry as subconsciousness and nocturnal. Conversely, Pushkin is characterized by solar logicism. Ivanov expands upon these ideas of Villa in his article on the latest theoretical exploration in the fields of artistic language, 1922. He argues that future is also characterized by logicism, but it is logicism immanent to his personality, whereas Pushkin's logicism is transcendent. It's within this context, Ivanov in this article refers to Pushkin as a name glorifier, citing that the names in his works are living energies of ideas. In contrasting Pushkin and Tyutchev, Ivanov aligns Tyutchev with myths, with myth, and Pushkin with logos. Tyutchev, when speaking of things mythologized, while Pushkin compels us to see them in their pure edited form. Ivanov says this is the essence of Pushkin's naming of things. However, this naming, and here Ivanov contrasts his view with that of Belis writing on Pushkin, has a certain natural limitation, a sacred boundary beyond which we encounter the ineffable, where logicism no longer functions. Ivanov asserts that the ancients were also aware of this sacred boundary naming. What insights can we glean from Ivanov's engagement with the theme of Pushkin as a name verifier? Obviously, Ivanov addresses this theme in his 1922 text and not in his earlier works, which explored Pushkin within a symbolist context as well. Because of the Yugoslavian movement's increasing prominence within the Russian intellectual landscape during the mid to late 1910s, and also because of Ivanov's own positive personal experience with name verifiers in 1916. In terms of content, both Yugoslavia and symbolism shared a similar intention, the intention of the immediate manifestation of the divine within the sensory world. From the Yugoslavian perspective, this manifestation occurs through the Jesus prayer and the remembrance of divine names, while for the symbolist it is achieved through poetic hieratic language. Therefore, Ivanov effortlessly linked Pushkin, an icon of Russian symbolism, with Yugoslavia. It is crucial to note Ivanov's emphasis on the sacred boundary of naming, beyond which we encounter the ineffable, as a characteristic, according to him, of Pushkin name verifier. While this thing is absent in his 1910 fundamental work, the Testament of Symbolism, where he touches Pushkin a lot and earlier. In my view, this suggests that Yugoslavia, Ivanov implies here in 1922 works, is the one in Pavel Florensky's specific Palamite interpretation elaborated by him during the mid to late 1910s, which hints on the principle of the unavailability of the transcendental divine realm. I believe that when Ivanov mentioned the ancients who knew about this sacred boundary of naming in this quote, he is specifically referring to the Palamites. In this context, I discern the influence of Florensky, also Frank Ivan, on the latter's conception of Pushkin as a name verifier. Okay, I have some material yet, but maybe it could be too long. Thank you.
Questions at the Okay. Thank you so much. Wonderful presentation. Next we have, I lost my page. Stephen Platform will be presenting, and I've got to let me change the slideshows here. It's time.
reading from my computer.
I know that.
At least, yeah.
You've completely played out.
I did one about 12 years ago in an emergency situation where the printer got broke.
There's a different.
Shoot.
Is it big enough?
So I once saw David Thea at a conference where the airline had Mr. His mother, but he did not have his paper. Proceeded to deliver long list with nothing. So there's also that options here.
There it is, yes, yes, you know, sometimes we know it better than we think we do. This is not one of those cases.
Same here.
So while that's being set up, I'll just say that the purpose of this talk is to create an enormous new swell of interest in the early 20th century Russian critic Yuri Eichenwald. So I'm glad that all of you are here to generate this enormous swell for me and with me.
Swell.
Very good. Are you not finding it? Is it not?
No, I do have it, I'm sorry, just right here.
I can even start reading. So the talk grows from my recent interest in the writings of Yuri Eichenwald. Actually, that's about the immanentist critic from the early 20th century, known today mainly, if at all, for his silhouettes of Russian writers, Eichenwald had a prolific life as an essayist on literature and related matters. He began his career closer to the world of philosophy, writing reviews in Vопросы философии и психологии and translating the collected works of Schopenhauer into Russian. His literary essays on specific authors or topics such as Poschlist, idleness, the writer and the reader, and many more, have interest in their own right. But just as intriguing is the extent to which Eichenwald, a very popular writer in his day, failed to leave much of a trace on subsequent literary scholarship. This oblivion is surely in no small part due to his denigration of any sort of scientific approach to studying literature or art, the precise direction scholarship was moving in just as he hit his stride as an essayist. Can I use these?
Yes.
Oh, I really want to be able to use these. But I don't want that slide showing yet, but I'll get there. Okay. Well, all right. I guess it works. I guess I can't use these buttons. Oh, I can. Yes, good. Sweet. All right. So the rise of science in literary studies, but Eichenwald was against it. The most noteworthy follower, if we can call him that, of or student of Eichenwald might be Vladimir Nabokov. Eichenwald did not write about empathy per se, the word in my title, and yet the way he wrote about artist-audience relations makes discussion of concepts regarding empathy in his era, and scrolling is always difficult. That's the hard part, right? And the years leading up to it, essential. However, I want to take a roundabout path to that discussion by way of Bakhtin, because even though there is no known intellectual connection between the two thinkers, their ideas cross paths in the vicinity of this topic, and Bakhtin helps us set the stage and the context for approaching Eichenwald's empathy-like theory of aesthetic activity. Bakhtin also makes a good entry point for two additional reasons. First, the theorist's obvious ongoing importance in current scholarship sets up a bridge back to those early decades. Second, the uncanny parallel between Bakhtin and Eichenwald in the area of intersubjective relations or communications makes them ideal imaginary interlocutors. In that context, the fact that Eichenwald's ideas were published nearly a decade before Bakhtin wrote his own down leads to further questions about intellectual genealogy, less about influence than about Eichenwald's own precursors and resources. We know from Gary Saul Morson and Carol Emerson that for Bakhtin's own writings, the term empathy requires special bracketing and care. And I'll be excerpting a couple parts of this long quotation. Rather than empathy, they write,
We need what Bakhtin calls live entering or living into another, Rivan. In this process, one simultaneously renounces and exploits one's surplus. Skipping a bit, I actively enter as a living being into an individuality and consequently do not, for a single moment, lose myself completely or lose my singular place outside that individuality. We see Morson and Emerson guiding us toward a particular feature of Bakhtinian thought, that empathy-like living into that both explores the other fully while retaining the wholeness of both selves, the exploring I and the contemplated other. This formulation will become important much later when we reach Eichenwald's related writings. A much more recent study by Alina Wyman has examined the tradition of empathy as Bakhtin may have absorbed it from the writings of the important German philosopher just a generation older, Max Scheler. Wyman describes how Scheler developed his ideas about empathy against the current that had been established by Theodor Lipps, the aesthetic philosopher who brought the term into common philosophical parlance. It was the Lipps formulation, or at least one of them, that Bakhtin was also reacting to in proposing a more active engagement between subject and object. Lipps's early version of empathy, as then understood, was essentially taken as a simple transference of emotions, a direct experiencing of the other without active participation or transformation. For Bakhtin, as for Scheler, a more dynamic model was needed. Wyman details how, for such a model, this emerges from an understanding of Christological symbolism, epitomized by the incarnation. I can skip this one and go to this one. Yes, in the context of the incarnation model, my consummating efforts in relation to the other must be understood as a movement away from the old, rigidly separated I for myself toward the new Christ-like one, and from the old, as it were, terminally objectified other for me toward the entirely new, gentle, and non-reifying means creative objectification. Note that word creative, and I'll skip the rest here. This active movement between one perceiving self and another perceived one is what allowed the aesthetic moment to become fully ethical, dynamic, and creative. This interpretation of the creative element of the process will become useful again when we turn to Eichenwald. Wyman writes, the gesture of embodying into the self, the gesture of embodying the gathered knowledge signals the beginning of a truly creative activity. Creation begins only with the return into the self. In contrast to abstract cognition, the active incarnated knowledge carries the mark of my participation in the emotionally warm, responsible relationship with the object, incorporating my emerging response to the object into this carefully shaped cognitive material. A bit later, she summarizes another key facet of this concept. Incarnation as a model of interpersonal communication results in the vision of dialogue in which my own spiritual growth is inextricably linked with the other's personal becoming. What emerges as striking in this evolving formulation is the way interpersonal communication becomes one's own spiritual, or I might say psychic, growth. This growth is linked to the other's becoming as well. The activity must also preserve the distinct individuality of the participants of subject and object so that the event does not become one of subjugation, annihilation, or psychic violence. Striking here is the attention to maintaining the integrity of two selves during an act that seems simultaneously to violate a boundary. Wyman explains, during the time when I project myself into the other, Bakhtin notes, I must virtually renounce my surplus of vision, not to overwhelm the less informed other. And skipping to the part you have in bold, it is equally important to protect the other from the complete loss of subjectivity on the way out when I complement his limited purview with my own finalizing surplus vision. I must render his horizon complete without at the same time forfeiting his distinctness, Bakhtin warns. The renunciation of surplus of vision is interesting inasmuch as this surplus is something inherently belonging to the observing in living self in relation to the observed or lived into other. Note the paradox here and hold on to it to remember a few paragraphs below. The I possesses a surplus of vision, but must virtually renounce this surplus, the definitive element of the key difference between self and other that allows for the complementing and finalizing. Renouncing the surplus prevents the forfeiting of distinctness. The phrasing emphasizes the full separate identity of the other and the need to respect her otherness, separate from whatever surpluses and complements I might wish to bestow upon her. These themes, in their Bakhtinian context, are well known to relate primarily to the manner in which an author self contemplates, envisions, and portrays an other in the guise of a literary protagonist, a writing self vis-a-vis a described other. However, the concepts and language are clearly made to apply to all intersubjective situations, and they carry the same ethical weight in these other domains. For the remainder of my talk, I'll turn toward a different dyad, the author and the recipient, that is, the reader of the text. I want to invoke Nabokov to help me make this transition, both because in this next quotation we see, both because in this next quotation we see most likely clear traces of Eichenwald's influence, and also because it offers a different view of the encounter of two selves. Up a trackless slope climbs the master artist, and at the top on a windy ridge, whom do you think he meets? The panting and happy reader, and there they spontaneously embrace and are linked forever if the book lasts forever. There's not much philosophical nuance in this statement. There's not meant to be, but the word embrace is interesting. In various contexts, Bakhtin and others have written about the notion of aesthetic love, and it is hard to banish love from a reading of this scene of the eternally embraced author and reader. I take this image to be a simple headline or a shorthand, if you will. The two selves remain distinct selves, but they are linked forever, and their coming together on that ridge has produced something new, precisely new, something that did not exist before they both, each of them, reached the ridgetop. Now, my next step requires some indulgence from all of you, but I'm going to reach back to the first coiner of the German term Einfühlung, source of our term empathy, Robert Vischer or Fischer. In his essay, The Aesthetic Act of Pure Form, Fischer wrote that the content of the work of art is precisely the artist. Genius is everywhere the soul of his creation. This romantically tinged understanding of art, developed in the 1870s, did not really survive into the later formulations of empathy theory developed by Lipps and others. But the existence of this idea at this date is intriguing, and it helps us finish building the bridge to the writings of Uli Eichenwald, who published his major theoretical treatise in 1911 in the third edition of his Silhouettes of Russian Writers. At this juncture, with 1911 in mind, it's important to note that Scheler's writings on these matters appeared in 1913, so that at the time he wrote, Eichenwald had access only to the Lipps-centered passive approach to empathy, and perhaps to resources such as Vischer. But like Vischer, he, of course, also had access to romantic aesthetic theories. Be that as it may, the formulations that Eichenwald developed are rich with resonances linking them to what I have cited above from Bakhtin. Notice, for example, how Eichenwald describes the reader's agency in regard to the author's creations, and also the author as other. For comprehending a writer means, to a certain extent, recreating him, repeating in his wake the inspired process of the writer's individual creativity. I'm going to skip to your bolded part now. Writers offering us their books offer themselves to others who are like them. Art embraces both its creators and its beholders within its circle. You might be looking at that word embraces and thinking already about that Nabokov quote above. It's not a bad idea, but that's not what I want to emphasize here. Notice how Eichenwald, like Vischer, equates the artist and the work offering their books, offer themselves. For Eichenwald, the artwork itself is, it seems, an avatar of its creator, essentially a new independent being, an other, a self in its own right. In other words, when we engage in artwork in any medium, We are ethically engaging another self in an act that entails all the components that Bakhtin describes in his author and hero formulations. Eichenwald is concerned to explore and describe the important elements of the viewer artwork encounter, specified to the reader-creator relation. He recognizes worries about subjectivity or subjectiveness in a reader's experience of an artwork and the relationship between that reader's subject and the distinct otherness of the artwork. Here, we can feel the concerns we saw above from Bakhtin's writings of the 1920s. Eichenwald wrote, so I'm going to just skip to the bottom here. No, I'll read the whole way. If the role of the critic reader consists primarily in the reception and reproduction of another's creation within one's own self, would this not mean that the critical work is fundamentally subjective? Unquestionably, the answer is yes, but in this subjectiveness reside not only the reader's rights, but also obligation. This subjectiveness is an inalienable fact which cannot and need not be renounced. Each person maintains a right to his own self. On the other hand, the reader is aesthetically obliged to surrender through and within his subjectiveness to the writer. The conclusion of this quotation is especially intriguing. There's not time here to go into details, but one might think that this formulation echoes the Christological structure that Wyman identifies in Max Scheler's and Bakhtin's writings. However, not only was Eichenwald of Jewish background, he converted to Orthodoxy in order to marry, but there is scant reference to such themes in or around his theoretical work. It appears that Eichenwald has devised his paradoxical idea, a subjectiveness that both surrenders and preserves itself through his own analytical process. There is a striking parallel between this statement and Bakhtin's formula mentioned above, according to which an observing self must nearly renounce the surplus of vision that enables the observer's complementing and finalizing of the other's image. Eichenwald goes on to note that the necessary condition for artistic experience is the audience. That is, it is our receptive capacity. If this did not exist, there would be nothing. There would be no work of art. The effects of art are born undeniably from the contact of two selves, the work's creator and the one being addressed through the creative work. This is why one must not renounce subjectiveness in the aesthetic moment. It is both inescapable and desirable. A corollary of this view, the necessity of the reader's subjective self to the existence of art, is Eichenwald's idea, also anticipating Scheler's more Christian idea, that it is through the encounter with the reader other that the artist comes to a fuller and deeper state of being. Since the writer does not exist until the reader-critic has approached and manifested him from him within himself, it is thus natural that the latter, the reader, can strengthen and deepen the writer through that self-activity. And thanks to the combination of two subjective essences, there arises a phenomenon even more complex and subtle than that writer. As part of this process, Eichenwald's reader bestows a kind of compliment upon the author, something akin to a surplus of vision that Bakhtin's contemplator holds in regard to the one who is observed. Because of this particular status of a distinct self, a subject within an individual's separate subjectiveness, each reader sees things the artist does not see and brings new things to the artwork. For Eichenwald, this process is eternal, endless, never to be finished, a fact that deserves more attention in relation to the hidden, private, inviolate interiority of the Bakhtinian subject. In other words, through an empathy-like activity, entering into the work of art, which is also the artist, right, is also the artist anticipating Rivanya, the reader maintains a self, respects the other, yet simultaneously holds a surplus of vision that creates the infinite nature of artistic phenomena. As he wrote, a writer's pages bestow on the critic such discoveries as never occur to their author, and the subjective identity of the critic extracts new and unexpected treasures from these dark mines. Say in a few lines, the creation is greater than the creator. This is because individual inspiration, no matter how lofty, cannot be torn away from the all-embracing creativity of nature itself. Art is cosmic, the writer is a collaborator. This last statement of Eichenwald's tilts toward the romantic, perhaps even the pantheistic. And this may, on further study, reveal the key difference between Eichenwald and his might-have-been successors, Scheler and Bakhtin. Unlike a Soviet scholar, at least, he felt no reason to shy away from such metaphysical formulations or understandings of art's place in the universe. Be that as it may, Eichenwald's vision of the artwork-contemplator relationship represents an early, perhaps unnoticed exploration of a crucial interaction of two selves during aesthetic activity. His insistence on maintaining both the distinct autonomy of each participant and the full openness of the ongoing moment of contact suggests the proto-Bakhtinian element in his aesthetic thought, which could have been absorbed and incorporated by writers such as Nabokov working in the decades after the publication. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Stephen. Okay, and our last presentation for this panel comes from the University of Southern California. And yeah, stop sharing and just keep this here for your presence for our online viewership.
I don't need it, so if you need the camera.
Can we just put it down here?
You're welcome to put that down there. I'm well aware of the last talk. I'll try to make it lively. We're all waiting for dinner, I'm sure. This is a distillation of a larger work, actually one larger, there's an even larger version of it. But I think I've managed to distill down to 20 minutes, and I realized here, sitting here in Evanston, that what I got it down to is 2 literary examples, 2 historical precedents, and 2 examples from literary theory. So there's more beyond that, but this is very good to get. And my idea is that all of these examples manifest or comment on the same phenomenon within Soviet literature. I want to look today at the type of utterance that I think is particularly prevalent within Soviet literature, that might even define it as a mode of discourse. I do so in homage to Saul Morson's The Boundaries of Genre. And this was supposed to be the performative moment in my talk, because the performative utterance needs an interlocutor. And this is going to be my paean to Saul. He's not here, so in absentia. In homage to Saul, The Boundaries of Genre, which I read early in my career and deeply admired, which taught me and many of us to see how dynamic textual utterances could be in the Russian context. But the type of utterance that interests me has pre-Soviet precedents as well, which might tell us something about the conditions of utterance that define the Russian context in general. This is my hypothesis anyway. And here I look to Saul's most recent Wonder Confronts Certainty. Yes, Saul, in absentia, I know there's a lot between his 2 works, almost all of which I've read. The sense of performance important here is that outlined in the speech theory of J.O. Austin. As Austin points out, utterances can be divided into 2 types. Constative utterances are statements that have the property of being true or false. Performative utterances, in contrast, accomplished by uttering the very act they denote. Quoting Austin, to issue such an utterance is to perform the action. Examples he gives are statements like, I apologize, I welcome, or one of my favorites, you are under arrest. Such statements are subject to their own forms of predicative unhappiness, he comments, but they are criticized from quite a different dimension from that of truth or falsity. I'm well aware that there are many other subsequent ideas about performative utterance and what it means in a variety of disciplines and so forth. The larger version of this engages with them, but for today, this will suffice for my purposes. A good example of this type of performative utterance in Soviet literature is Vladimir Mayakovsky's late poem, Vavis Golos. The poem's very title underscores the performative element of voice, and the immediacy of speaking in the poem is emphasized throughout in a series of apostrophes to workers of the future, the poet's imagined comrade descendants. Уважаемые товарищи потомки, слушайте, товарищи потомки, и все я даю тебе планеты планетарии and so forth. The apostrophes reach their crescendo in a characteristically brazen Mayakovskian address to comrade life itself, which he invites to help him speed the 5-year plan to its conclusion. Товарищи, давай быстрее протопаем по пятилетке дней остаток. Beyond the text itself, the situation in which Mayakovsky composed Vavis Golas shaped it as a performative act. He intended it to serve as the introduction to a longer poetic work dedicated to the 5-year plan, and wrote it to accompany an exhibit titled 20 Years of the Work of Mayakovsky, which opened on the 1st of February 1930 at the Federation of the Union of Soviet Writers. The exhibit displayed facets of his career, from volumes of his poetry to models of his set designs for the theater and political posters and cartoons he had produced for the Soviet telegraph agency Rosta. Mayakovsky read, performed, one could say, Vavis Golas at the exhibit's opening. So that in the moment of its recitation, lines in the poem like Paradum razvernu moich stranic vойска, rolling out the pages of my verse like a parade, pointed indexically to items in the exhibit, constituting a metaleptic gesture, a reaching across the frame of the poem into the present moment of its recitation, that underscores its status as immediate utterance or performance. In its initial draft form, the line in which Mayakovsky brandishes all 100 volumes of My Party books, play on the Russian phrase "partiyная knижка," which was a membership card in the Communist Party, made another metaleptic gesture to the exhibit. It read all 6 volumes instead of 100, because by that date, only 6 volumes of a projected 10-volume collected works had been published and were on display at the exhibit. What lends Vavis Golas its poignancy is its brash declaration in the exegi monumentum tradition that the poet's works constitute a monument to him more enduring than anything made of bronze, in the famous line. This bid for existential superiority constitutes the poem's performative message. By its means, Mayakovsky outmaneuvers his interlocutors, the party, and its strident supporters in Rap, by claiming in advance a future transcendence. The gesture acquires particular poignancy when we realize that he committed suicide in 1930, only a year after he wrote the poem. These are lines like "Мой стих трудом громаду лет прорвет и явится всему грубо зримо, мне наплевать на бронзы многопудие, мне наплевать на мраморную сызнь," and so on and so forth. Instead, he's going to raise, "Я подниму, как большевистский партбилет, все 100 томов моих партийных книжек." Another closely contemporary example is Yuri Alesh's 1927 novella Zavist, which stands as a remarkable instance not just of narrative, of literary depiction, but of speech in the Soviet world in the 1920s, late 1920s. The work's most distinguishing feature, in effect its very point, is its plaintive first-person narration, which in Alesh's text, as in Mayakovsky's declamatory verse, serves as the formal realization of its performative mode. Zavist gives vent to a protest by the pre-revolutionary intelligentsia against the new world of Bolshevism, but intent, in the words of its narrator, Kavalerov, on shaking the heart of the burnt-out era as one shakes a fading light bulb one last time. Kavalerov laments that his role in this new Soviet life is insignificant, a servant's role. Role моя ничтожна, халуйская роль, which I read in Russian because haluski is a term with cultural resonance, as I will discuss in a minute. His marginalization is communicative as well as social. He is essentially unheard in the new Soviet world and has no voice in it save that of resentful complaint. The specifically performative aspect of which emerges when he declares that Andrei Babichev, the model Soviet citizen, is a great sausage maker, confectioner, and a cook, and I, Nikolai Kavalerov, am his jester. А я, Николай Кавалеров, при нем шут. Zavist particularly highlights another aspect of performance in the early Soviet era. It's actually explicitly theatrical quality, the suggestion that the behavior of a Kavalerov, or Alesha, or Mayakovsky's recitation of Vavis Golas should be seen as an intentional symbolic display, the acting of a role on a stage. Alesha's text wallows in theatricality. Its crisis scene in the inset Tale of Two Brothers, which depicts Ivan Babichev's imaginary confrontation with his model Soviet brother and his own imagined death by impalement, are conspicuously theatrical events performed on stage at the imagined opening ceremony of the cafeteria that Andrei Babichev has designed. The name Ivan gives his imaginary machine of retribution, Ophelia, symbolizes madness in the first instance, suicidal romantic madness of artists in particular, but also points to a play, Hamlet, within which a play, The Mousetrap, is performed just as the Tale of Two Brothers and the Fantasy Attack figures imagined plays within the larger narrative of Zavist. The theatrical resonance of Alesha's own performance as a jester in the world of Soviet letters is underscored when Cavalero's ally Ivan Babichev, Karamazovian altar brother to Andrei, announces that when he tours taverns making pathetic speeches, he performs on the stage of history, quoting in English. Many characters have acted up the comedy of the old world, he pronounces. Now the curtain descends. The characters must now rush to the front of the stage and sing their last couplets. I want to mediate between them and the audience. I want to conduct the chorus and be the last to exit the stage. His declaration invokes the tradition in drama known as Theatrum Mundi, or Theater of the World, which is represented in such works as Pedro Calderón de la Barca's El Gran Teatro del Mundo and Shakespeare's As You Like It, well-known passage, All the World's the Stage, and so forth. But Theatrum Mundi was not Alesha's idiosyncratic metaphor. It figured prominently in early Soviet culture as an essential framework for public rituals staged by the government, which included, inter alia, such spectacles as symbolic burnings of the old world acted on Red Square. In the staging of Mayakovsky's 1918 play Mysteria Bouffe, which figured a globe on the stage, and especially conspicuously in early Soviet mass festivals like Mysteria Освобожденного Труда, which displayed a panorama of the proletariat's rise through world history. Lunacharsky opined that these festivals were a means whereby the Soviet people now demonstrates its soul before itself. But in reality, they had more to do with the regime seeking to impose symbols of its nascent rule, and in so doing to allay its own genealogical insecurity, i.e. in their own right, they were less a celebration of anything than a performative appeal on the part of the regime. And I have a book about this, don't worry about that. Where the clownish performance of Zavist attains its poignancy is in the sense of apocalypse that the theatrical metaphor brings in tow. Events unfold on the stage of history, Alyosha suggests, because history is approaching its apocalyptic end, when the Soviet era itself will be subjected to summary judgment, an implicit in polemic with Bolshevism's self-affirming view of recent events. Just as the tale's physiological themes, insistent attention to things like sausage and bodily decay, works once one gets beyond the Freudian joke to underscore the idea of mortality that physical being implies, so too does the polemic engaged on the stage of history serve to remind the regime that its own performance in that space will be governed by those laws. Now the precedents. The narrator's self-conscious abasement in Alesha's text, of course, reprises the ready-made precedent of Dostoevsky's Zapiski's Podpolye, a link that points toward an additional way of understanding performance in the Soviet context. Zapiski's Podpolye was itself a preeminent example of performative utterance in the 19th century, far outstripping in its histrionic intensity works like Gogol's Zapiski Sumashedsheva or Turgenev's Dnevnik Vishny Человека. Dostoevsky's narrator puts his subjectivity on display, contradicting himself several times within the first few paragraphs, parading his illness, social insignificance, and failures, all the while mounting his bid, as Alyosha's narrator does, and arguably Mayakovsky in his own way, for what might be called philosophical preeminence. Я муха, всех умнее, всех развитие, но муха. Dostoevsky's narrator declares, while Alyosha's Cavalier thinks of Babichev, in what way am I worse than him? Is he smarter than me, more soulful? By making this pleading voice the only discursive agent in the text, Dostoevsky elevates it to the level of philosophical authority. This is the rhetorical payout of the plaintive performative mode. When Kavalierov echoes the perverse clownishness of the underground man by declaring that he is a jester, shoot, he invokes another cultural name, this is historical precedent too, as well, the deeper one, that of the skamarok, a type of jester or minstrel known in medieval Rus. The jesting of the skamarok was inherently ephemeral, but at least one medieval text is believed to embody a record of such performance. The 13th century Marinia Danila Zatochnika, Supplication of Daniel the Exile, is one translation of that title, whose author was a citizen of Pereyaslav, evidently an erudite young man fallen in distress. The Malenia can be seen as setting a precedent within Russian culture for works like those by Dostoevsky and Alyosha as a distinctly literary form of appeal. In other words, doing this in literary form goes back a long way in Russian culture. As Stender Peterson comments, instead of personally appealing to Prince Yaroslav Vsevolodovich, the addressee, the author composed a poetic lamentation in order to arouse sympathy for himself. Like Zapiski is Podpolya and Zadis, the lamentation uses the first person voice, heightening the prospect for what Jakobson called emotive speech, that is, speech meant primarily to draw attention to itself, to the speaker. It also underscores the communicative moment by insistently beginning nearly every one of its stanzas with an apostrophe to the prince. We call Mayakovsky's apostrophes to the worker. Kняжня мой господиня, господиня преклони ухо твое. Notably, the words Lord and Prince here appear in the vocative case, a marker of emotive immediacy now largely absent from modern Russian. Daniil abases himself before Yaroslav, pointing to his poverty and low status, in contrast to Yaroslav's wealth and generosity. Compare with Kavalerov's statement in Zavis, Rol moya nichtojna haluyskaya rol. Haluy is an archaic pejorative term for slave. Like the underground man Kavalierov, he claims a position of wisdom in paradoxical contrast to his indigence. Azbo yesem adiyanim skudin, no razum adbigin. The roots of this posture, which combine anxious appeal with sardonic mockery, may lie in the anthropological situation of the Skamarok in medieval Rus. As Brussels Goethe remarks, according to Afanasiev, the pagan Slavs were animus and tried to invoke and appease nature by performing certain ritual ceremonies. In Goethe's account, much of the Skamarok's role in Rus derived from their being holdovers of a pagan religion, i.e. bearers of an alien belief system, who were forced to find accommodation within the now dominant Christian culture. They did so by becoming professional performers, mutatis mutandis, not unlike Alesha's position within Soviet cultures. Minstrels in the matter of Byzantine mimes a German Spielname, who had become a familiar sight in the larger cities of Kiev and Rus, but ones whose performance was always laden with memories of an older ritual act of appeasement. Now to the theoretical ideas. One exemplary formulation of this idea within Soviet literary critical culture is Yuri Tinyanov's 1922 essay, Oda как ораторский жанр, the ode as oratorical genre. Tinyanov argued that in one of its most important variants, the Russian 18th century ode was structured not around its content as something to be read in contemplation, but as a script intended for performance at the imperial court. As Tinyanov points out, in an early draft of his 1948 Rhetorica, Lomonosov outlined devices with which the poet could convince a listener of what the ode asserts. But in the final version, he replaces with an emphasis on speaking eloquently, krasno говорить, in order to sway the listener, преклонить слушателя. This declamatory moment, ораторский момент, now became the dominant, the organizing and defining principle of the Lomonosovian ode. Lomonosov's handbook correspondingly emphasized the genre's articulatory side, произносительная сторона, the phonic and metric elements he saw as tending to heighten its emotional impact, including gestures like raising one's hand, which were not represented directly in the printed text. Think of Mayakovsky reading Vavyskos, pointing to his works there. The Lomonosovian ode thus sought less to elaborate a theme than to use its ostensible content as an occasion for exerting emotional impact on its addressee. In fact, as recent studies suggest, much of formalist theory can itself be understood as performative writing. Peter, how am I doing on time? Am I running? Okay. I'm hitting the place where I have Lazieki, but I can cut it out.
No, wait.
A trait which at least suggests why Tinyanov may have been able to possess. Let me just pause and say, the reason why I think these ideas are there in formalism, or the formalists are behaving in this way, is that this is what utterance is all about in the Soviet context. They're simply scholars, intellectuals who are meta-discursively aware of this. So recent scholarship on formalist theory, in Jan Levchenko's view, formalists deploy their own writings with a dual purpose. So that, for example, Tinyanov's dedication of his essay, Pромежуток, to Pasternak was meant as an act of theoretical expansion, which claimed him as an opayaz poet. While his dedications to Shklovsky in Literaturny Fakt and Eichenbaum, Literaturная эволюция, turned the respective articles into encoded messages to friends and colleagues. And one thing that I think is typical of performed utterance is there's a dual purpose, there's duality. What looks like the content in a way recedes into the background. So I really don't care what I'm writing in Pромежуток. What I want to do is enlist Pasternak as an opayaz poet. That's a reductionist view of it, an extreme version of it, but something like this is going on. Shklovsky's own publication in 1925 of Sentimentalное путешествие as a supplement to the journal Огонек was a gesture, this was by Levchenko, of supplication by a repentant enemy of the revolution, and quoting him, could not be a demonstrative act, essentially a performative utterance. Lipchenko argues that as political pressure on the formalists grew in the mid to late 1920s, their works increasingly took on a dialogic aspect, his term, which rendered their very theorization performative, his term also, as when Eichenbaum in 1927 published Literatur und Buit, which makes the capitulatory gesture of acknowledging the influence of sociological factors on literature in the ardent rap journal Na Literaturen Pastu. In the case of Shklovsky, particularly comes the theory of literature turns into literature itself, a literature tending towards self-description. Again, the essay in which Tynyanov selects the performative aspects of Lomonosov's odes to illustrate the concept of the dominant emerges out of this very context. Nor should it, now I'm on the downward slope, Peter, so tell me when I need to nor should it surprise us that the theory of the novel elaborated by Mikhail Bakhtin, one of his culture's preeminent theorists of the speech act, resonates with these very issues. And I'm going to pause and say, here I go again, as President Reagan would say, there you go again. I'm going to say, I enormously admire Saul Morson and everything he's written. I sometimes, however, want to insert a specialist awareness of the culturally conditioning factors that might define this or that statement by A. Bakhtin, or even in a scene in a novel by Dostoevsky, that I think we do also need to be aware of. So I'm going to somewhat suggest that there may be a universalizing Bakhtin, but the Bakhtin also came out of Soviet culture and is defined by, in part, whether this has to do with free will or not, I don't know. So what I'm suggesting is that Bakhtin's ideas came out of the same, emerged within the same discursive domain, in his case, principally Stalinist, and were subject to the same constraints as the literary works by Mayakovsky and Alyosha that were examined above. Bakhtin begins by rejecting the monologic understanding of novelistic discourse that he sees in traditional stylistics. Instead, he finds in the novel an artistically organized social polyphony, which serves as the site of a social dialogue of languages. But his theory also posits a distinct moment of intentionality behind novelistic discourse. The word in the novel manifests intention, that is a directedness to an object. This intention is communicative in the novel for Bakhtin. Every word in the novel, he asserts, is directed toward an answer and cannot escape the profound influence of the word it anticipates in response. And he talks about all languages being ideologically saturated. I think what, in my view, in this context, was going on in Bakhtin says that everything, all novelistic words, you could almost take that as meaning all public speech, is uttered. Now, the nice version of this, the early Bakhtin, искусство и ответственность, which we hear, forgive me, as if in a sermon. There are others. I cannot be completed without the other, and so on and so forth. But another way of reading Bakhtin, especially the writings by Bakhtin that emerged later, is that I must always be anxious about the response to what I'm saying, because I'm living in a coercive climate. Bakhtin does not say it that way, but I'm suggesting this is something can be read. These statements by Bakhtin can be read as aptly describing what I've here been calling the performative aspect of works of Soviet literature, as opposed to mimetic representation of characters and events, which is the traditional concern of realism. Bakhtin's works also harbor implicit notions of discursive responses to what might be called the anxiety of power relations, along lines suggested in the longer versions by Foucault, Bourdieu, and others, as well as by the far older precedent of the Skamorok, with his cajoling performance before power. I would suggest that notes of tension sound within Bakhtin's otherwise affirmative descriptions of Dostoevsky and ideological exchange. In his account, the novelistic word is beholden to the anticipated response of an other. Quoting Bakhtin, the word has a double directedness, at once toward the object of speech as an ordinary word, and at the other's word, as toward alien speech, not чужую речь. I always have to worry about what that чужая речь is going to be. I'm suggesting there's an element of worrying, not just appreciating, wait, if I want to hear, Peter, your word. In Bakhtin's Stalinist-inflected, I'm arguing, suggesting view, the others, this is quoting him again, the others' words always sound on our lips as words alien to us. Very often with a mocking, exaggerating, утрирующее, sarcastic intonation. This is Bakhtin. One of his observations about Gayatkin and Dostoevsky's Dvainik particularly could be read as resonating with this kind of reference to his own context. Quoting Bakhtin in English, you'll be happy to hear. His thought develops and evolves as the thought of someone personally offended by the world order, personally humiliated by its blind necessity, end of quotation. Bakhtin describes the speech aspect of Biedni Люди, Dostoevsky's first novel, as one which develops, quoting him, the abased, приниженная variant of this style, the contorted word, with its timid and bashful glance over its shoulder, с робкой и стыдящейся оглядкой, and muted shout, с приглушенным вызовом. This is the celebrated word слово с оглядкой that Bakhtin describes to novelistic discourse in general. And there's a much larger debate here that I will not go into, having to do with, in the Soviet context, the nature of Soviet personhood, the extent to which, as Donna Orwin commented this morning, they internalized revolutionary logic or had to cynically adopt it. And there are people who invoke Mark Lipovetsky at Columbia, calls this cynicism. And then there's another school of thought that says, no, they were wholly remade without a trace of resistance as Soviet, indeed Stalinist subjects. But that, not to mention the debates of performativity and identity and gender studies and so forth. There's a lot more that this could potentially tap into. But let me move ahead here to say whether, this is my conclusion, whether in hindsight, Bakhtin's theories are best understood as expressing a longing for carnivalesque freedom in the depths of Stalinist depression, or unwittingly echoing the regime's own repressive structure. He says every utterance has to be worried about what somebody is going to say. That's sort of the more anxious version of performative utterance, where I was also thinking of, I believe it was one of Saul's quotations this morning about having the luxury or the egoistic indulgence of having an opinion. Well, it's sort of a way of describing what Alyosha and Mayakovsky do when they can get away with it. It's a Russian expression, which I know from my USC and Cornell colleague, Ali Zholkovsky, показать кукиш в кармане. You give the finger, but in your pocket. You're still giving the pocket is the regime's imposition of its rhetoric and discourse and sense of identity on you, but giving the finger is your act of free will. And it's fraught, you're giving it in the pocket, because that кукиш в кармане and so forth. Where is Stalinist identity and that's a cynical view. Or unwittingly echoing the regime's own structures, Bakhtin's thought. For example, as Boris Groys has argued, he's a very prominent figure, has argued that Bakhtin is all a reflection of Stalinism. One can surmise that Bakhtin writes on the vagaries of voice because they're all around him. They define the world in which he lives. The political and social conditions under which Soviet literature developed encouraged, if they did not outright compel, a performative mode in authors. The pressures exerted on writers by the Soviet regime can be charted as evolving from an individual poet's appeal to listen to the music of the revolution, that's Bloch, to the vaguely Marxist social command widely invoked as motivation for writing politically conformist works in the 1920s, to the socialist realism openly legislated as the obligatory method to be adopted by all Soviet writers. As the examples of Mayakovsky and Alyosha, together with the medieval precedent of the Skomorokh they invoke, suggest the fundamental situation of Soviet literature is one of performative speech constituting an appeal to power. The object of this appeal often was quite specific, as Evgeny Dobrenko remarks about the vituperative speeches Andrei Zhdanov gave in the 1940s denouncing the journal Leningrad, and the writers Anna Akhmatova and Mikhail Zoshenko. Stalin, and not the writers or the party workers, was their only real addressee. Works like Vagius Bolus and Zavist, as well as formalist theory and Bakhtin's theory of the novel, emerged not as eccentric departures from the norms of Soviet literary speech, but as eruptions onto its surface of a meta-commentary on its underlying rules. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Wonderful talk and interview for this. Yes, we have about 23-ish minutes for questions. Question. Comments.
I got plenty of questions. Dimitri, I wonder, could you tell us a little bit more about Biely's characterization of Pushkin versus Syuchev that Ivanov was disagreeing with?
So, in general, they use about Pushkin and Tyutchev were similar in many relations, but so just my point is that Ivanov started when Ivanov was speaking about Pushkin, he started to focus on some borders of ineffable, and Biely didn't do such a focus. So and as far as I understand Biely, he thought in symbolistic poetic universum everything is expressed, everything can be uttered, and in special poetic symbolistic way. And on the late stage of contemplating about on symbolism, Ivanov, in opposition to Biely, started to appear that there is something no possible to utter. This is the difference. And my point is, it was Palamide version of Yugoslavian teaching on language, which Ivanov was influenced on.
May I ask
Yeah.
Steve a question?
Please.
I thank you for your talk. I'm where are you on this though, Steve? Here's my question. You write about, Nabokov and Eichenwald. And when you read that quotation from Nabokov about the author, the writer and the reader happily embracing, I don't think that's a Bakhtinian embrace at all. It's I Nabokov, the writer, happily embrace you, the reader of my book. I'm not gonna toil my way up a mountain to read anything you wrote. I mean, the book is such a solipsist. Do you see this as really having much purchase in Nabokov's own sense of writer-reader? Would Nabokov allow, for example, the comments that you quoted about the role of the critic? Well, Nabokov allowing critics to, it sounds like reader response criticism.
Right.
So
So
Nabokov allow readers to define his works.
So there's one place where he does, and it's this one part of Eichenwald that I've wondered for a long time, or I did wonder until I found this quotation that I'll utter in a second. Eichenwald says, so you remember where Nabokov says the greatest creation of the writer is his readers, right? The writer creates his readers. Well, guess who said that first? Eichenwald said it first. Maybe somebody said it before Eichenwald. Maybe Tolstoy said it. I don't know. But Eichenwald said he says the writer creates the reader, but the reader also creates the writer. Now you wonder, did
That's Eichenwald.
Eichenwald. Now, so you wonder. This makes you wonder. Did Nabokov part ways with Eichenwald at the pause, right? At the structural break in that construction. And I mean, I think one could, just based on abstract evidence in the works, one could argue it both ways. And people have, and I've argued it in the more kind of congenial side that you're pushing back against. But there is this relatively, except by me, underquoted line in Nabokov's reply to Karl Popper when Popper sent him his annotations to Lolita. He sent him the keys to Lolita, and he wrote a letter back to him. And I'm gonna not be exact enough in quoting it, but he says essentially, many of your formulations are instances of are things that never entered my mind, they're either examples of an artist's inspiration or a critic's, and then some other kind of, a critic's ingenuity. And then he added in a handwritten footnote at the bottom of the letter, otherwise, why bother in your case as well as mine? Which seems like an outright statement of acceptance that deep down, the reader has free will and a life and engages and creates, and that is what matters. And without that, there is nothing. Why bother? So, I mean, up until that letter, I could argue my side of things and say, I see evidence for this and I can argue in favor of this view. But I mean, I think we see Nabokov embrace it. I think he'd like to hide that. And talking about why Nabokov liked to hide that facet of aesthetic activity, that's another question I haven't resolved. I don't know why he liked to hide it, but I do think he believed in it. And that's my evidence for that idea. I have a question for you too. Can I?
Yes, of course.
Can I grab my ping pong paddle? So I wanted to ask you, I was not able to determine, as you were working through the quotations, and talking about, I think especially Dostoevsky book quotations, I could not tell if you were working exclusively from the, 1961, 62 revision, or were you also having some specific excerpts that were from the 1928 Bakhtin's Dostoevsky book? And in 28, so if he's
The later.
so I'm wondering, I'd be curious to know, does he say things in the 1928 book that are
So it's
the same?
I think it was primarily
Gorgeous, right. Yeah, so how much of what you're seeing in Paetiki is already present in Tvorчество? And if it's there in Tvorчество, does that change your interpretation? Because Stalin really only, he only consolidated in 1928, I think, right?
I wouldn't insist on the complete identification of key Bakhtinian ideas with Stalinism per se versus the Soviet 1920s. But I do think that there's an argument, it's made by people not other than me, that and there are two schools of thought. One says the ideas like about carnival are responses to Stalinism, that they imagine an alternative world and form of human existence.
Mhm.
Others, like Royce, say, no, they replicate the oppressive structures of Stalinism. There's a wonderful line in Royce's essay on carnival, is "Не дай Бог там показаться." A total, it's like the total total communal dominance of your individuality is gone, and you're dominated by this communal being, which is devoted to manifesting the functions of the body below the waist. "Не дай Бог там показаться." Why would you want to be a part of this? Which is partly tongue in cheek, I think. But in answer to your question, it would be interesting to go back and see if there is an evolution where increasing mirror imaging of something Stalinist does appear in the later work. But I'm guessing that no, because I'm guessing that the coercive structures were there. They simply intensified before in the 20s. That and Mayakovsky are pre-Stalin.
Yeah.
So it's there.
Yeah.
And it manifested itself fairly early on in the 20s.
True. Yeah.
But yeah, whether in some rhetorical examples you could find where it becomes more evident in the later work, I have to go back and look at it. I tend to work with the problem of Paetiki rather than the earlier. I have to dig up the other one.
It was the word anxiety that I wasn't sure about. Because if you look at Bakhtin, I think that more people would read him as celebratory than anxious. And so I wonder if it's more that there's an assertiveness there. I think that you're correct, that there's an edge to the way that he asserts the value of the self in this context, but I'm not sure I would call it anxious. I'm not sure I would call it stressed about what the state is doing, because he believes so deeply in the inherent value of the individual that I think he's asserting it, but I'm not sure that he's afraid.
It does come out, or a description of a dialogical situation, which is clear anxiety, does come out in his reading, some of his readings of Dostoevsky, Vainik, for example. And what I'm suggesting, so no, the anxiety is not denotatively present in Bakhtin. It's a connotation that I'm projecting onto, suggesting might be there, simply in the idea that, what I'm saying is, well, you've got these writers who feel they have to, for whom the dominant mode of literary discourse is to perform this appeal to power. It's always governing what you do. I could argue that all of socialist realism performs in that respect. And then you've got Bakhtin saying, well, the word in the novel always has to anticipate the response. So what I'm saying, is there not a kind of parallel here between, even though, yes, if you simply isolate Bakhtin and read him, but I'm kind of reader or scholar who likes to read things in cultural context. I'm also clearly somewhat of a cynic about Bakhtin. I admire him enormously. I don't believe in Saint Bakhtin.
Of course. Yeah. No, and I think that maybe it's just the word anxious in particular.
That's
To say that he's shadowed by the cultural context. Absolutely.
This is my reading
Yeah.
of it. I'm projecting anxiety onto Bakhtin. I don't think he's influenced by my anxiety, but
Well, as we're drilling Tom here, but this isn't pushing back on something, but I'm fascinated, and I know this is part of a bigger project, so, and you said you engage more with different types of performative utterance, and so naturally my mind went there anyway. But it may be in ways that are relevant to what you were talking about, and the periodization question even, because if I think of Austin's examples that at least that I remember the best, I pronounce you husband and wife, I think is one of them, right? Or you are under arrest. Just the saying of those words changes something. Performative in a different sense from I like your jacket, which is maybe trying to get you to like me too or something.
Like I crazy.
Yeah. So and those the two about marrying somebody, marrying a couple, or arresting somebody, clearly presuppose my
power to do so.
Empowerment by a larger structure, right? A different relation to a kind of structure. Well, okay, so that's a different one than is Kovalyov and the underground man, possibly Mayakovsky, want that power. And they're frustrated they don't have it. Why are you not caring? Why am I not changing things?
They do and they don't have it. So yeah, I mean, in a longer version, I hope I addressed more nuance in this, but in my view, they do and they don't have it because it's a sly seizure of power, rhetorical seizure of power, which is akin, deepest roots in something like a scholarly performance, where, hey, I know you're in power, but basically you're an idiot.
Right.
Smart one, you're an idiot.
But the more we have to ramify the subtleties of the battle that I win, the more undergroundish I become. Yes, I win because you don't know that I know, that that people are going to treat you. The other kind of power is the sort of what is this? Will no one rid me of this turbulence? Or the Mafia Don or Ivan Karamazov saying should such a man doesn't deserve to live, or denunciation in Pravda, where you're not saying exile this person into the labor camps, but that happened, you get denounced. It's not directly I pronounce you husband and wife, but it is going to have that material state sort of backed response in a way different in the 30s from the 20s. I think in the 20s, that might be a sort of difference in the tone here, that that kind of anxiety about what is the eye for the other, let's say in the Bakhtinian thing in the 20s, strikes me as different from the 30s if we're thinking about this historical context. Here's nothing. I don't know if there's any. But it's come. I'm looking at the clock, so I don't want to curtail.
Yes, for Thomas, thank you very much for this talk. I particularly enjoyed the idea of Mayakovsky in the company of the underground man and the new version of unsavory character, which is very interesting observation further. But to bring the Russian expression уничижение падче гордости. This self-deprecation that is stronger than any arrogance.
Yeah, than arrogance.
So this seems to be the case in all your case studies. So you call it performative, and indeed it is performative in the not in the Austin sense today, but in the sense of directness of engagement of the interlocutor, of the audience, directness that you do not put a screen of a text between yourself and the interlocutor by that, but the element of manipulation in that. So in disguise of directness and this self-deprecating, giving all the ground to the manipulative, I think it is worth considering this element in the state of and in Bakhtin perhaps.
I am obviously not a psychologist, but I guess there must be something similar phenomenon in psychology coming out of vulnerable narcissism or something like this, where the whining and the self-abasement is actually highly manipulative and an instrument of control over others. Not all the instances I'm thinking of are really. Mayakovsky is not whining. Well, he knows how to whine, but he whines in a very arrogant way. But for me, the difference is between a kind of parallel would also be, a constitutive utterance is one that's. So I think this may not really exist anywhere. People would argue that it never really exists, but a realist novel whose primary interest is in depicting something in life and holding up truth is very different from a work that is, well, appearing to do that, actually trying to gain something. And that, I think, is a difference that defines a lot of Soviet literature.
Mayakovsky actually is quite desperate when he's right.
Well, and the interesting thing about Mayakovsky is that in a longer version of this, I talked about Tinyanov talks about the parallels between the 18th century and the Soviet period, which of course Abraham Tierks in his essay on socialist realism pointed out. And Tinyanov says one of the most classical poets is Mayakovsky. And I, in that longer version, say I think the reason why Mayakovsky inclined towards these odic 18th century forms was their performative mode. They provided an opportunity for performative verse.
Yeah, we've got a little bit more.
Quick question for Steve. I'll just cut to the chase. What do you think the purpose for Eichenwald of literary theory is? It's not scientific. It's about these maybe two subjects merging or embracing. So this correct description of what happens in reading or in art or something. What is this just a description of what he thinks it is? Is this something, is this embedded in a discourse, philosophical discourse, methodological discourse?
It's almost self-contained. So he had one more essay where I would say called The Writer and the Reader, in which he expands a little bit on one corner of this set of ideas. The theoretical treatise is about, I want to say, so we have a translation of it that'll come out later this year or next year, a selection of his essays, Tatiana Gershkovich and I. But I think it's about 40 pages. So it's not hugely long. I would say it's coherent, it's organized, it's a treatise. It's Theoretические предпосылки is the title of the document. And I would say he's, as a person who's been working in philosophy for much of his adult life up to that time, he wanted to lay out. I mean, he had become a literary critic, right? He was working primarily as a critic, working as in a subjectivist, immanent criticism mode that he espoused and believed to be useful. But I think he decided that he should have a theoretical background that was showing why his mode of criticism was valuable. And I don't think that he felt that he needed to keep theorizing. He didn't. I mean, although he had the philosophical training and background, that wasn't the main place where he wanted to do his work. He wanted to do his work as a reader, as a critic. But then he clearly felt that he wanted to, ought to, and could express clearly what he was doing and why what he was doing was different from sociological readings of literature that were becoming dominant at that time. And so he was trying to create a theoretical justification, a philosophical justification for why it's worth it to continue reading and talking about literature subjectively. And actually why it's worth, I mean, here's another thing that Nabokov seems to get, maybe gets from Eichenwald, right? Nabokov says, don't identify with the characters in the novel, identify with the author of the novel, which is exactly what Eichenwald is telling his readers to do. And it's kind of what he does too in his silhouettes of Russian writers. He's in a sense kind of trying to channel the writers in collecting what he thinks are the most representative examples from the writers that he gives a silhouette to, an epitome of their work, I would say, that he tries to channel into a coherent whole. So he's in a way leaving philosophy, but this is his last effort in philosophy to create this coherent statement of a very human, subjectivist, individualist mode of engagement with artworks. That's just about being a person in contact or communication with another person.
Wonderful, that's right at time. So thank you again so much to our panelists. Next, we'll be